Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe, it really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight, we journey to a small Connecticut town where the impossible collided with reality, where faith met fear, and where a simple argument ended in death. This is the story of Alan Bono's murder, a case that would become the first and only time in American legal history that demonic possession was attempted as a defense for murder. Picture, if you will, the quintessential New England town of Brookfield, Connecticut, in the winter of 1981. Snow dusted the colonial homes, bare maple trees lined quiet streets, and the community of just over 15,000 souls lived in the kind of peaceful anonymity that small towns treasure. For 193 years, Brookfield had maintained an almost impossibly clean record, not a single murder had stained its history books. The town's pride in this statistic wasn't mere boasting. It represented something deeper, a genuine sense of community, of neighbors who knew one another, of problems that were solved with conversation rather than violence. Children walked to school without fear, doors remained unlocked, and the most serious crimes typically involved teenage mischief or the occasional domestic dispute that was quickly resolved. But beneath this veneer of New England tranquility, something extraordinary had been brewing for months in one particular household, something that would shatter Brookfield's peaceful reputation forever and introduce the nation to one of the most bizarre criminal cases in American history. The Glatzel family seemed, from the outside, perfectly ordinary. Judy Glatzel was a hard-working mother trying to keep her family together. Her daughter Debbie, 26 years old, worked various jobs to help support the household. Debbie's boyfriend, 19-year-old Arne Cheyenne Johnson, was a tree surgeon, young, strong, and devoted to Debbie and her family. And then there was 11-year-old David Glatzel, Debbie's little brother, who should have been worried about nothing more than homework and weekend plans. But David Glatzel was far from ordinary. Throughout 1980, the boy had been experiencing what his family could only describe as supernatural torment. It began innocuously enough, as these things often do. David would wake screaming from nightmares, claiming he saw horrible figures in his room. His mother initially dismissed these as typical childhood fears, the boogeyman under the bed, shadows on the wall taking frightening shapes. However, David's episodes quickly escalated beyond anything resembling normal childhood anxiety. He would speak in voices that weren't his own, describing violent acts and using language that no 11-year-old should know. His behavior became erratic and sometimes dangerous. He would injure himself, claim invisible forces were attacking him, and demonstrate knowledge of events and people he had never encountered. The family, devout Catholics, first sought help through their church. When local priests proved unable to provide answers or relief, word of David's condition reached Ed and Lorraine Warren, the famous paranormal investigators who had built their careers studying supernatural phenomena. The Warrens had investigated thousands of cases across the globe, but they would later describe the Glatzel situation as one of the most severe they had ever encountered. After spending time with David and observing his behavior, the Warrens reached a chilling conclusion: the boy was possessed not by one demon, but by dozens of them. They claimed to have documented evidence of 43 distinct demonic entities tormenting the child. This wasn't mere speculation on their part. They meticulously recorded David's episodes using audio equipment, photographed physical manifestations, and maintained detailed written logs of each supernatural occurrence. What followed were multiple attempts to free David from his supernatural affliction. 6 Catholic priests became involved in the case, participating in a series of exorcisms throughout late 1980 and early 1981. These were not the Hollywood dramatizations you might imagine, but intense, exhausting spiritual battles that would leave everyone involved physically and emotionally drained. During these sessions, David's behavior was beyond disturbing. Witnesses reported that he would contort his body into impossible positions, speak in languages he had never learned, and display superhuman strength that required multiple adults to restrain him. His voice would change completely, becoming deeper, older, filled with a malevolence that chilled everyone present. He would reveal intimate details about the lives of the priests and others present, information he could not possibly have known through normal means. The most unsettling aspect of these sessions wasn't David's behavior, but what the priests and the Warrens claimed was happening to the demonic entities themselves. According to their accounts, the demons were becoming increasingly agitated and desperate as the exorcisms continued. They threatened everyone present, promised revenge, and spoke of their intention to harm the Glatzel family in ways that defied imagination. It was during one of these tense exorcism sessions that Arne Johnson made a decision that would change his life forever. Seeing the torment his girlfriend's little brother was enduring, overwhelmed by compassion and perhaps youthful bravado, Arne challenged the demons directly. He taunted them, told them they were cowards for picking on a child, and demanded that they take him instead. According to the Warrens and the Glatzel family, this was precisely what the demons were waiting for. They had been seeking a new host, someone older and stronger than David, someone they could use for darker purposes. Arne's challenge provided them with the perfect opportunity. Witnesses claimed that at the moment Arne made his demand, David's episodes suddenly ceased, and an oppressive presence seemed to shift from the boy to the young man. The change in Arne Johnson wasn't immediate, but it was noticeable to those who knew him well. Friends and family members would later testify that Arne, who had always been good-natured and even-tempered, began experiencing mood swings and periods of inexplicable rage. He would have blackouts, waking up with no memory of what he had done or where he had been. Sometimes, Debbie would find him in the middle of the night, standing motionless in their apartment, staring at nothing with an expression she didn't recognize. These episodes worried Debbie, but Arne always seemed to return to his normal self after a few hours or days. He would apologize profusely for any strange behavior, claiming he didn't remember what had happened. The young couple tried to maintain some sense of normalcy, but the stress was taking its toll on their relationship and their daily lives. It was around this time that Debbie found work at the Brookfield Kennels, a dog boarding facility on the outskirts of town. The owner was Alan Bono, a 40-year-old man who had recently moved to Connecticut from New York. Bono was something of an enigma to the local community, friendly enough, but clearly an outsider who didn't quite fit into Brookfield's tight-knit social fabric. Alan Bono was a man whose life had taken several unexpected turns. He wasn't originally from Connecticut, and his decision to purchase and operate a dog kennel seemed somewhat arbitrary to those who knew him. Some described him as charming and generous, while others found him pushy and difficult to work with. He had a tendency to drink heavily, particularly in the evenings, and could become argumentative when intoxicated. Despite his quirks, Bono offered Debbie steady work, and she needed the income. The job also came with a small apartment above the kennel, which she and Arne could use when needed. This arrangement brought the young couple into regular contact with Alan Bono, and while their relationship was generally cordial, there was an underlying tension that everyone could sense but no one could quite define. February 16, 1981, began like any other winter day in Brookfield. The temperature was cold but not unbearable, and a light snow covered the ground. Debbie was working at the kennels, tending to the dogs and managing the day-to-day operations that Alan Bono, despite being the owner, seemed unable or unwilling to handle himself. That afternoon, Arne came by the kennels to visit Debbie and help with some of the heavier work. With him were David Glatzel and David's cousin Mary, both children who often spent time at the kennel after school. It was meant to be a routine visit. Arne would help with the dogs, the children would play safely in the enclosed area, and everyone would head home before dinner. Alan Bono had been drinking throughout the afternoon, which wasn't unusual but was noticeable. His mood seemed darker than normal, and he was making comments and advances toward Debbie that made everyone uncomfortable. When the children arrived with Arn, Bono's behavior became even more inappropriate and aggressive. What exactly triggered the confrontation remains a matter of some debate, but the basic facts are these: Alan Bono, emboldened by alcohol and frustrated by various business and personal problems, began making increasingly inappropriate comments and advances toward Debbie. When Arn intervened to protect his girlfriend, the situation escalated rapidly from verbal arguments to physical confrontation. Witnesses would later describe Arnie's demeanor during these crucial moments as completely unlike his normal personality. Instead of the calm, measured young man they knew, they saw someone filled with a rage that seemed almost supernatural in its intensity. His voice changed, his posture became threatening, and his eyes took on what several people described as a wild, almost inhuman, appearance. The argument moved from the main office of the kennel to the outdoor area where the dogs were housed. Alan Bono, despite being intoxicated, was a large man and not easily intimidated. He continued his aggressive behavior, pushing the confrontation toward violence. The children, terrified by what they were witnessing, huddled together as the two men faced off. What happened next lasted only seconds but would reverberate through the legal system for months and capture the attention of the entire nation. According to witnesses, Arn Johnson seemed to undergo a complete transformation. His face contorted with fury, and he pulled out a 5-inch pocketknife that he normally used for his tree surgery work. The attack was swift and brutal. Johnson stabbed Alan Bono multiple times, more than 20 wounds to the chest and torso. The violence was so sudden and intense that the witnesses, including young David and Mary, were frozen in shock and terror. Within minutes, Alan Bono was dead on the floor of his own dog kennel, victim of Brookfield's first murder in nearly 2 centuries. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Debbie screamed for help while trying to comfort the traumatized children. Arn, his knife still bloody, seemed to snap back to his normal consciousness, staring in horror at what he had done. He made no attempt to flee or hide evidence. Instead, he sat down next to Bono's body and waited, seemingly in a state of complete shock and confusion. When the police arrived, they found a scene that would haunt many of them for years to come. Alan Bono lay in a pool of blood, his body bearing the evidence of a frenzied attack. Arn Johnson sat nearby, no longer showing any signs of the rage that had consumed him minutes earlier. The children were traumatized but physically unharmed, and Debbie was trying to explain to the officers that something supernatural had occurred. The arresting officers expected a straightforward case. A young man had killed his girlfriend's employer during an argument, probably over money or work conditions. Domestic disputes that turned violent were sadly common, and while this one was more brutal than most, it seemed to fit familiar patterns. They arrested Arn Johnson for murder and began what they thought would be a routine investigation. What the police and prosecutors didn't expect was Arn Johnson's defense strategy. Within days of his arrest, Johnson's attorney announced that his client would be pleading not guilty by reason of demonic possession. The defendant, they claimed, could not be held responsible for his actions because he had been under the control of supernatural forces at the time of the murder. This wasn't a strategy born of desperation or legal creativity. Arn Johnson genuinely believed that he had been possessed, and his family, girlfriend, and spiritual advisors supported this claim. The Warrens provided extensive documentation of the supernatural activity they had witnessed in the months leading up to the murder, including audio recordings, photographs, and detailed written accounts. The legal system had never encountered anything like this before. How do you prove or disprove demonic possession in a court of law? How do you present evidence of supernatural activity to a jury trained to consider only empirical facts? The case immediately attracted national media attention, with reporters and legal scholars debating whether such a defense could or should be allowed. Judge Robert Callahan, who would oversee the trial, found himself in an unprecedented position. He had to decide whether evidence of supernatural possession could be admitted in a criminal proceeding. After careful consideration and extensive legal research, he ruled that while Johnson could claim he was not responsible for his actions due to mental impairment, testimony about demons, possession, and supernatural forces would not be allowed in court. This ruling effectively eliminated Johnson's intended defense strategy, but it didn't end the controversy. The story had already captured public imagination, and people across the country were debating not just Johnson's guilt or innocence, but the very nature of good and evil, the existence of supernatural forces, and the limits of legal responsibility. The trial of Arne Cheyenne Johnson began in October 1981, 8 months after Alan Bono's murder. Despite the judge's ruling excluding supernatural evidence, the case remained one of the most closely watched legal proceedings in Connecticut history. The courtroom was packed daily with reporters, curiosity seekers, and supporters of both the defendant and the victim. Without the ability to present evidence of demonic possession, Johnson's defense team was forced to rely on more conventional strategies. They argued that their client had been temporarily insane at the time of the murder, suffering from a mental break that left him unable to control his actions or understand the consequences of his behavior. They presented testimony from family members and friends describing Johnson's personality change in the months leading up to the killing. The prosecution, led by the state's attorney, painted a different picture. They argued that Johnson had committed a brutal, premeditated murder during an argument with his girlfriend's employer. They emphasized the number and severity of the stab wounds, suggesting that this was not the action of someone having a temporary mental break, but rather a deliberate and sustained attack by someone in full control of his faculties. Debbie Glatzel's testimony was particularly compelling. She described the months of supernatural activity that had plagued her family, her brother's possession and exorcism, and the personality changes she had observed in Arne. While she couldn't directly discuss demonic possession due to the judge's ruling, she painted a picture of a young man who had sacrificed himself to save her little brother and was now paying the ultimate price for his heroism. The prosecution countered by focusing on the physical evidence and the testimony of witnesses who had seen the attack. They argued that regardless of what Johnson or his supporters believed about supernatural forces, the fact remained that he had brutally murdered an innocent man and must be held accountable for his actions. After deliberating for 15 hours, the jury reached their verdict on November 24, 1981. They found Arne Cheyenne Johnson guilty of first-degree manslaughter, rejecting both the murder charge sought by the prosecution and the complete innocence claimed by the defense. The compromise verdict reflected the jury's belief that Johnson had indeed killed Alan Bono, but that there were mitigating circumstances that reduced his culpability. Johnson was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison, a relatively light sentence for such a violent crime. The judge acknowledged the unusual circumstances of the case and the defendant's lack of prior criminal history in determining the punishment. Johnson would ultimately serve only 5 years before being released on parole in 1986. The trial's end didn't diminish public fascination with the case. Books were written, documentaries were produced, and the story continued to be debated in religious, legal, and paranormal circles. The Warrens wrote extensively about their involvement in the case, and their account became one of the most famous in their long career of investigating supernatural phenomena. For the Glatzel family, the trial's conclusion brought mixed feelings. They were relieved that Arne hadn't received a harsher sentence, but they remained convinced that supernatural forces had been responsible for the tragedy. David Glatzel, the boy at the center of the original possession case, grew up bearing the weight of knowing that a man had died because of events that had started with him. In the years following the trial, various family members and witnesses began to offer different versions of events. Some maintained their original stories about supernatural possession and demonic activity. Others suggested that the entire case had been exaggerated or even fabricated for financial gain, pointing to book deals and media appearances that had enriched some of the participants. David Glatzel himself would later file a lawsuit, claiming that the Warrens and others had exploited his childhood trauma for profit and that much of the supernatural activity had been fabricated or grossly exaggerated. This legal action created additional controversy and raised questions about what had really happened in Brookfield during those months in 1980 and 1981. The case also raised broader questions about the role of mental illness in criminal behavior and the way society deals with claims of supernatural activity. Medical professionals who reviewed the evidence suggested that David Glatzel might have been suffering from a severe psychological disorder that was misinterpreted as demonic possession by well-meaning but misinformed adults. Similarly, Arne Johnson's behavior in the months leading up to the murder could be explained by various psychological factors, including the stress of dealing with his girlfriend's family crisis, financial pressures, and the influence of adults who convinced him that he was possessed by demons. The power of suggestion, particularly in a religious and emotionally charged environment, can be profound and lasting. Today, more than 4 decades after Alan Bono's murder, the case continues to fascinate and divide people. It has inspired movies, including The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It, countless books, and numerous television documentaries. Each retelling seems to emphasize different aspects of the story: the supernatural elements, the legal precedent, the family tragedy, or the social and psychological factors that contributed to the violence. For those who believe in the supernatural, the Johnson case represents proof that evil forces can and do influence human behavior in measurable ways. They point to the extensive documentation provided by the Warrens, the testimony of multiple witnesses, and the involvement of Catholic priests as evidence that something genuinely supernatural occurred in Brookfield. Skeptics, however, see the case as an example of how religious fervor, financial motivation, and psychological suggestion can combine to create elaborate false narratives around tragic but explicable events. They argue that David Glatzel was a troubled child who needed medical attention rather than exorcism, and that Arne Johnson was a young man who committed murder during a moment of rage and then sought to escape responsibility by claiming supernatural influence. The truth, as is often the case with such controversial events, likely lies somewhere between these extremes. What cannot be disputed is that a man died violently, a young man went to prison, and a family was forever changed by events that began with an 11-year-old boy's nightmares and ended in Connecticut's most famous murder case. The impact of the case extended far beyond the immediate participants. Brookfield itself struggled to come to terms with losing its reputation as a peaceful, crime-free community. The media attention brought unwanted notoriety to a town that had valued its quiet anonymity. Property values in the area around the kennels decreased, and some residents reported feeling unsafe for the first time in their lives. The Catholic Church, while maintaining its belief in the reality of demonic possession, became more cautious about publicizing exorcism cases. The controversy surrounding the Johnson trial highlighted the potential legal and social complications that could arise from high-profile supernatural interventions. For the legal profession, the case established important precedents about the limits of supernatural defenses in criminal cases. While Johnson's attorneys were not allowed to present evidence of demonic possession, the case sparked ongoing debates about the relationship between religious beliefs, mental health, and criminal responsibility. Law schools began using the Johnson case as a teaching tool for courses on unusual defenses, evidence rules, and the intersection of law and religion. Legal scholars published papers analyzing whether Judge Callahan had made the correct decision in excluding supernatural evidence, and what might have happened if such evidence had been allowed. Alan Bono was buried in a small cemetery not far from where he died, his grave marked with a simple headstone that gives no indication of the extraordinary circumstances of his death. He remains the victim in this story, a man whose life was cut short during what should have been a minor workplace dispute. Arne Johnson served his time and was released from prison in 1986. He married Debbie Glatzel shortly after his release, and the couple moved away from Connecticut to start fresh in a place where their names wouldn't be recognized. They have largely avoided media attention in the years since, preferring to live quietly and put the past behind them. David Glatzel grew up to become an adult who continues to grapple with the events of his childhood. In recent interviews, he has maintained that he was indeed possessed by demons, but he has also expressed frustration with how his story was commercialized and sensationalized by others. His experience serves as a reminder of how childhood trauma, whatever its origin, can have lasting effects on a person's life. The Brookfield Kennels, where the murder took place, eventually closed down. The building where Alan Bono died was torn down years later, but locals still point out the location to visitors interested in the case. Brookfield has returned to being a quiet New England town, though it can never quite escape its connection to one of America's most unusual murder cases. And so our story ends where it began, in a small Connecticut town where the ordinary and the extraordinary collided with tragic consequences. Whether you believe that demons walked among us that winter day in 1981, or that human psychology and tragedy created an elaborate myth around a simple murder, one thing remains certain: the case of Alan Bono's death will continue to fascinate, perplex, and divide people for generations to come. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you'll wonder about the nature of good and evil, the power of belief, and the thin line between the explicable and the mysterious. The story of what happened in Brookfield reminds us that truth is often more complex than it first appears, and that some questions may never have definitive answers. Please, if you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we explore true crime stories in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe, so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight, we're exploring one of the most psychologically complex cases in criminal history, the story of Edmund Emil Kemper III, known to the world as the co-ed killer. This is a tale that spans decades, from a troubled childhood in 1940s California to a terrifying killing spree that would forever change how we understand the criminal mind. So, let me take you through this haunting journey into darkness. Our story begins on December 18, 1948, in Burbank, California, where Edmund Emil Kemper III was born into what would become a deeply fractured family. From the very beginning, young Edmund's life was marked by instability and emotional turmoil that would shape the man he would ultimately become. Edmund's parents, Clarnell and Edmund Kemper Jr., had a volatile relationship that cast a long shadow over their son's formative years. His parents' volatile marriage, coupled with his mother's emotional and psychological abuse, played a significant role in shaping his troubled psyche. Clarnell was described as a domineering, emotionally abusive woman who seemed to take particular pleasure in belittling her son. She would often lock young Edmund in the basement, claiming she was afraid he would molest his sisters, a cruel and damaging accusation that would echo through his mind for years to come. The family dynamic was toxic in ways that extended far beyond typical dysfunction. Edmund's mother would make cutting remarks about his appearance, his intelligence, and his prospects in life. She seemed to view her son not as a person to be nurtured, but as a burden to be endured. This constant emotional assault began to warp Edmund's developing sense of self-worth and his understanding of relationships, particularly with women. As Edmund grew, so did his physical stature. By his early teens, he was already towering over his peers, eventually reaching an imposing 6 feet 9 inches tall and weighing over 300 pounds. But this impressive physical presence masked a deeply wounded psyche. He was described as being overwhelmed with feelings of worthlessness, guilt, parental rejection, and having great fears that he will suffer a psychotic episode. The dysfunction at home was compounded by Edmund's struggles at school and with his peers. His massive size made him stand out in ways he didn't want, and his increasingly odd behavior began to alienate those around him. He would later describe feeling like an outsider, watching normal social interactions from the periphery, unable to participate in the natural give-and-take of childhood friendships. As the psychological pressure mounted, Edmund began to exhibit disturbing behaviors that should have served as warning signs. He would later reveal that during this period, he had thought long and hard about suicide and has attempted it repeatedly over a number of years. But alongside these self-destructive impulses, darker fantasies were beginning to take root, fantasies that involved power, control, and violence against others. The breaking point came when Edmund was sent to live with his paternal grandparents in North Fork, California. This was meant to be a fresh start, a chance for the troubled teenager to find stability away from his mother's toxic influence. Instead, it would become the setting for the first chapter in a story of unimaginable violence. The summer of 1964 was sweltering in the rural community of North Fork, California. 15-year-old Edmund Kemper was living on his grandparents' ranch, ostensibly to give him a more stable environment away from his mother's psychological abuse. But the damage had already been done, and the time bomb that had been building inside the troubled teenager was about to explode. Edmund's grandparents, Edmund Sr. and Maud Kemper, were trying their best to provide structure for their grandson. They were simple, hard-working people who had spent their lives on the ranch, and they hoped that the quiet, rural setting might help calm the boy's increasingly disturbed behavior. But they couldn't have anticipated the depth of the psychological damage that had already taken root. On August 27, 1964, what started as an ordinary summer day would end in tragedy that would shock the local community and mark the beginning of Edmund Kemper's transformation from troubled youth to cold-blooded killer. The exact details of what happened that day have been recounted by Kemper himself in various interviews over the years. According to his own account, he had been having an argument with his grandmother, Maud, about some trivial matter. But for Edmund, there were no trivial matters anymore. Every interaction was charged with the accumulated anger and resentment of years of abuse and emotional neglect. In a 1974 interview, Kemper said that while living with his grandparents, his domineering grandmother emasculated him and his grandfather. Kemper said, "I couldn't please her. It was like being in jail. I became a walking time bomb." On that fateful August afternoon, the walking time bomb finally detonated. Edmund retrieved his grandfather's .22 caliber rifle and, in a moment that would forever alter the trajectory of his life, shot his grandmother in the head as she sat at the kitchen table. The sound of the gunshot echoed across the quiet ranch, but there was no one around to hear it except for Edmund and his dying grandmother. What happened next reveals the calculating nature that would become Edmund's trademark. Rather than panic or flee, he calmly waited for his grandfather to return from running errands in town. When the elderly man arrived home, he was met by his grandson holding the rifle. Edmund shot his grandfather as well, killing him instantly. Later, when asked by investigators why he had killed his grandfather, Edmund's response was chillingly matter-of-fact. He didn't want his grandfather to have to see what had happened to his wife. It was a twisted form of mercy that revealed the complex and disturbed thought processes that were already governing Edmund's actions. After the murders, Edmund called his mother to tell her what he had done. His calm demeanor during this call would become another signature element of his criminal behavior, the ability to compartmentalize violence and discuss it as casually as one might discuss the weather. Clarnell instructed her son to call the police, which he did, surrendering himself without resistance. The double murder sent shockwaves through the small community of North Fork. Here was a 15-year-old boy who had calmly executed his own grandparents, then called the authorities to turn himself in. It was the kind of crime that challenged everyone's understanding of human nature and juvenile behavior. For his crimes, Kemper was handed over to the California Youth Authority. He underwent a variety of tests, which determined that he had a very high IQ, but also suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. The psychological evaluations revealed a brilliant but deeply disturbed mind. Edmund scored remarkably high on intelligence tests, but the same evaluations uncovered severe mental illness that had been brewing beneath the surface for years. After being deemed mentally unstable, he spent 5 years at Atascadero State Hospital, a maximum security facility for mentally ill criminals, before being released on parole when he was 21. When Edmund Kemper was released from Atascadero State Hospital in 1969, he was 21 years old, stood nearly 7 feet tall, and carried with him the clinical designation of having been cured of his mental illness. The hospital staff, impressed by his apparent progress and his exceptional intelligence, had deemed him ready to rejoin society. It was a decision that would prove to have devastating consequences. The young man who emerged from the hospital appeared to be a success story of the mental health system. He had participated in therapy sessions, shown remarkable insight into his past crimes, and demonstrated what appeared to be genuine remorse for killing his grandparents. His IQ had been measured at an impressive 145, and he had used his time in the hospital to educate himself extensively. To many observers, he seemed like proof that even the most troubled individuals could be rehabilitated. Edmund moved back to live with his mother, Clarnell, in Santa Cruz, California. This decision would later be questioned by many who followed his case, given the documented history of psychological abuse between mother and son. But at the time, it seemed like a natural step for a young man trying to rebuild his life. For the next few years, Edmund lived what appeared to be a quiet, unremarkable existence. He held various jobs, including work on highway construction crews that took advantage of his imposing physical stature. Neighbors said Kemper, who had been collecting workmen's compensation since an injury in 1972 on a highway construction job, seemed like a gentle giant who kept to himself but was polite and helpful when needed. During this period, Edmund even harbored ambitions of joining law enforcement. He flew under the radar for a couple of years, at one point even applying to be a state trooper, but being rejected because, at 6 feet 9 inches and 300 pounds, he was too big. This rejection would later take on a darkly ironic significance, as Edmund would go on to develop a fascination with law enforcement procedures and would even socialize with off-duty police officers at a local bar. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, darker impulses were stirring once again. The psychological damage that had led to the murder of his grandparents had not been truly healed, it had merely been suppressed. The toxic dynamic between Edmund and his mother continued to fester, with Clarnell maintaining her pattern of emotional abuse and belittling behavior. Edmund began to spend time at a bar called the Jury Room, which was popular with local police officers and sheriff's deputies. He would sit quietly, nursing his drinks and listening to the conversations around him. The officers, unaware of his criminal history, came to know him as Big Ed, a friendly giant who seemed fascinated by their work. They would regale him with stories of their cases, unknowingly providing him with insights into police procedures, investigative techniques, and the inner workings of law enforcement. This period of Edmund's life reveals the calculating nature that would later characterize his crimes. He wasn't simply lying dormant, he was learning, observing, and preparing. His interest in police work wasn't born of a desire to help society, but rather from a need to understand how law enforcement operated so that he could eventually outwit them. The psychological pressure was building once again. Living with his abusive mother was reactivating all the old patterns of emotional damage, while his rejection from law enforcement had dealt a blow to his fragile sense of self-worth. Edmund later described this period as one of increasing inner turmoil, where violent fantasies began to intrude on his thoughts with greater frequency and intensity. By 1972, these fantasies were no longer enough to satisfy the dark urges that had been growing inside him. The quiet years were coming to an end, and Edmund Kemper was about to embark on a killing spree that would terrorize the Santa Cruz area and establish him as one of America's most notorious serial killers. The spring of 1972 marked the beginning of what would become known as the Co-Ed Killer Murders, a series of crimes that would terrorize the Santa Cruz area and showcase the methodical, calculating nature of Edmund Kemper's murderous mind. By this time, Edmund had been living what appeared to be a normal life for nearly 3 years since his release from Atascadero, but the psychological pressures that had been building were about to explode in the most violent way possible. On May 7, 1972, Edmund was driving through the campus area of UC Santa Cruz when he spotted 2 young women hitchhiking. Mary Ann Pesci, 18, and Anita Lucchesa, 18, were both students at Fresno State College who were visiting friends in the area. They had no way of knowing that accepting a ride from the friendly giant behind the wheel would cost them their lives. Edmund's approach to his victims was carefully calculated. He had modified his car specifically for his crimes, removing the door handle on the passenger side so that once someone got in, they couldn't easily get out. He had also installed a fake badge and police equipment to lend credibility to his persona as someone connected to law enforcement. When the two young women got into his car, Edmund initially drove normally, engaging them in casual conversation. He was articulate, intelligent, and seemed harmless, qualities that made his victims comfortable and unsuspecting. But as they drove further from the campus area, Edmund's demeanor began to change. The details of what happened next are disturbing and speak to the calculating cruelty that characterized all of Edmund's crimes. Rather than simply killing his victims quickly, he seemed to take pleasure in their fear and confusion. He would later describe in clinical detail how he had tied them up, driven them to a remote location, and then methodically murdered both young women. After killing Pesci and Lucchesa, Edmund didn't simply dispose of the bodies and move on. Instead, he took them back to his apartment, the same apartment he shared with his mother, and spent hours dismembering the corpses. This wasn't done out of necessity to hide evidence, but rather seemed to fulfill some deeper psychological need for control and domination over his victims. The level of planning and forethought that went into these murders was extraordinary. Edmund had clearly thought through every aspect of the crimes, from the initial abduction to the final disposal of evidence. He had prepared his vehicle, selected his hunting grounds, and even planned how he would explain any blood or other evidence that might be found in his car or apartment. What makes Edmund's crimes even more chilling is the fact that he was able to return to his normal life afterward, showing no outward signs of the horrific acts he had committed. He continued to live with his mother, went to work, and even socialized with the police officers at the jury room, all while the bodies of his victims lay hidden in various locations around Santa Cruz County. The murders of Pesci and Lucchesa established a pattern that Edmund would follow for the next 11 months. He targeted young women, often college students, who were hitchhiking or otherwise vulnerable. He used his imposing size and apparent trustworthiness to gain their confidence, then isolated them before revealing his true intentions. From there, Kemper continued his murder spree, killing again on September 14, 1972. Like with his first murders, Kemper picked up a hitchhiker, 15-year-old Aiko Koo, who had missed her bus to dance class. Aiko Koo was a Korean-American teenager who had been trying to get to her dance class when she accepted what she thought was a helpful ride from Edmund. Like his previous victims, she had no way of knowing that her decision to trust this seemingly gentle giant would be her last. The murder of Aiko Koo followed the same horrific pattern as the previous killings, but with even more disturbing elements. Edmund later described how he had engaged the young girl in conversation, learning about her dreams and aspirations, before calmly ending her life. The psychological cruelty of this approach, getting to know his victims as people before killing them, reveals the depths of Edmund's sadistic nature. As 1972 turned into 1973, Edmund Kemper's confidence as a killer was growing. Each successful murder had taught him something new about victim selection, crime scene management, and avoiding detection. The quiet, methodical giant had become a predator who stalked the highways around Santa Cruz with increasing boldness and sophistication. On January 8, 1973, Edmund struck again, this time targeting Cindy Schall, an 18-year-old student at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Schall was hitchhiking when she encountered Edmund, and like his previous victims, she had no reason to suspect the danger she was walking into. Edmund's imposing physical presence and calm demeanor continued to serve as the perfect camouflage for his murderous intentions. The murder of Cindy Schall followed the same horrific pattern, but Edmund's post-murder behavior was becoming increasingly bizarre and disturbing. After killing Schall, he once again brought the body back to his mother's house, where he spent considerable time dismembering it. What made this particular crime even more chilling was that Edmund's mother was home during part of this process, completely unaware that her son was committing unspeakable acts just floors away from her. This ability to compartmentalize his criminal behavior while maintaining normal relationships reveals the sophisticated psychological mechanisms that Edmund had developed. He could engage in casual conversation with his mother, go to work the next day, and socialize with police officers, all while carrying the knowledge of his recent murders. This wasn't simply the behavior of someone who was mentally ill in a traditional sense, it was the calculated behavior of someone who understood exactly what he was doing and was taking deliberate steps to avoid detection. The investigation into these murders was becoming increasingly intense, but Edmund seemed to stay one step ahead of law enforcement. His knowledge of police procedures, gained through his conversations at the jury room, proved invaluable in helping him avoid the mistakes that might have led to his capture. He knew how evidence was collected, how investigations were conducted, and what behaviors might trigger suspicion. On February 5, 1973, Edmund claimed his next victim, Rosalind Thorpe, a 23-year-old student. Later that same day, he also murdered Alice Liu, a 21-year-old student. The fact that he killed 2 people in a single day speaks to the escalating nature of his crimes and his growing confidence in his ability to evade capture. The murders of Thorpe and Liu were particularly brutal, even by Edmund's standards. The level of violence and the methodical nature of the killing suggested that Edmund was no longer simply satisfying some psychological urge, he was actively enjoying the process of murder and the sense of power it gave him over his victims. Throughout this period, the Santa Cruz community was living in fear. The local media had begun to connect the various murders, and it was becoming clear that a serial killer was operating in the area. Parents were warning their children not to hitchhike, and the atmosphere of trust that had characterized the laid-back college town was rapidly eroding. What made the situation even more terrifying was the fact that the killer seemed to be specifically targeting young women, particularly college students. The University of California, Santa Cruz, which had previously been seen as a safe haven for learning and personal growth, was now viewed with suspicion and fear. Students who had once thought nothing of hitchhiking or walking alone after dark were now taking elaborate precautions to ensure their safety. But Edmund was about to make his most shocking move yet, one that would bring his killing spree to a dramatic and unexpected conclusion. The target of his final murders wouldn't be random strangers picked up along the highway, but the person who had shaped his psychological development more than anyone else, his own mother. By the spring of 1973, the relationship between Edmund Kemper and his mother, Clarnell Strandberg, had reached a breaking point. The same toxic dynamic that had characterized their relationship throughout Edmund's childhood was still festering, made worse by the psychological pressure of Edmund's secret life as a serial killer. The very woman who had created the monster through years of emotional abuse was about to become his final victim. Easter weekend of 1973 would mark the end of Edmund's killing spree, but not before he committed what many consider to be his most shocking and psychologically revealing murders. With the murder of his mother, Clarnell Strandberg, and her good friend, Sally Hallett. On Good Friday, April 20, 1973, the simmering tension between Edmund and his mother finally boiled over. He went to his mother's home, where the two had an unpleasant exchange. Kemper attacked his mother after she went to bed. But what happened that night went far beyond a simple domestic dispute. It was the culmination of decades of psychological damage and murderous rage. According to Edmund's own later accounts, the final argument with his mother began over something trivial, but quickly escalated as all their interactions seemed to do. Clarnell, true to form, began berating her son, using the same cutting words and psychological tactics that had been her weapons of choice throughout his childhood. But this time, Edmund wasn't the helpless child who had to absorb the abuse. He was a 6 feet 9 inches, 300-pound man who had already killed 6 people and had nothing left to lose. After his mother went to bed, Edmund retrieved a claw hammer and entered her bedroom. What happened next was perhaps the most psychologically significant moment of his entire criminal career. The woman who had shaped his warped psychology through years of emotional abuse became the victim of the monster she had helped create. The murder of Clarnell wasn't simply an act of violence, it was the ultimate expression of the rage and resentment that had been building inside Edmund for his entire life. In killing his mother, he was finally taking control of the relationship that had defined and damaged him. It was both an act of revenge and an attempt to free himself from the psychological chains that had bound him since childhood. But Edmund wasn't finished. The next morning, he called Sally Hallett, his mother's close friend, and invited her over for dinner. When Hallett arrived at the house, she had no idea that she was walking into the lair of a serial killer who had just murdered his own mother. Edmund killed Hallett as well, later explaining that he didn't want her to discover his mother's body and that he needed more time to figure out his next move. The murders of his mother and her friend represented a turning point for Edmund. Throughout his previous crimes, he had been careful to maintain the facade of normal life, returning home after each murder to continue his routine. But with his mother dead and her friend's body also in the house, there was no going back to any semblance of normalcy. What happened next reveals another aspect of Edmund's complex psychology. Rather than fleeing or trying to dispose of the evidence, he got in his car and began driving east, seemingly without any clear destination or plan. For hundreds of miles, he drove through the night, wrestling with what he had done and trying to decide what his next move should be. Finally, in Pueblo, Colorado, Edmund made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He pulled over at a phone booth and called the Santa Cruz Police Department to turn himself in. When the dispatcher initially didn't believe that he was the co-ed killer, Edmund patiently provided details about the murders that only the perpetrator would know. The confession call was characteristic of Edmund's personality: calm, articulate, and oddly cooperative. He provided detailed information about where the bodies could be found and gave a clear account of his actions. It was as if the same methodical nature that had made him such an effective killer was now being applied to the process of surrendering himself to justice. When asked later why he had decided to turn himself in rather than continue his flight or even take his own life, Edmund's answers revealed the complex psychological motivations that had driven his actions throughout the killing spree. He spoke of feeling a sense of completion after killing his mother, as if that had been the ultimate goal all along and the other murders had merely been practice or preparation. The arrest of Edmund Kemper sent shockwaves through the Santa Cruz community and the law enforcement agencies that had been hunting the co-ed killer for nearly a year. Here was the man who had terrorized the area, killed 8 people, and managed to evade capture while socializing with the very police officers who were investigating his crimes. The arrest and subsequent interrogation of Edmund Kemper provided law enforcement and psychologists with an unprecedented opportunity to peer into the mind of a serial killer. Unlike many criminals who maintain their innocence or refuse to cooperate, Edmund was remarkably forthcoming about his crimes, providing detailed accounts of his actions and insights into his psychological motivations. During the extensive interviews that followed his arrest, Edmund demonstrated the same intelligence and articulate nature that had helped him evade capture for so long. He spoke about his crimes with a clinical detachment that was both fascinating and deeply disturbing to those who interviewed him. Kemper's psychological profile is complex, characterized by a combination of narcissism, antisocial behavior, and a deep-seated need for control. One of the most striking aspects of Edmund's confessions was his ability to analyze his own behavior and motivations. He spoke extensively about the relationship with his mother and how it had shaped his attitudes toward women and authority figures. He described feeling powerless throughout his childhood and how the act of murder had given him a sense of control and dominance that he had never experienced before. Edmund's high intelligence, measured at an IQ of 145, was evident in the way he discussed his crimes. He understood the psychological concepts that investigators and mental health professionals were using to analyze his behavior, and he was able to engage in sophisticated discussions about his own pathology. This level of self-awareness was unusual among serial killers and provided valuable insights into the criminal mind. The interviews revealed that Edmund's crimes had not been impulsive acts of violence, but rather carefully planned and executed operations. He described how he had studied potential victims, modified his vehicle to facilitate abductions, and developed elaborate methods for disposing of evidence. Every aspect of his criminal behavior had been thought through and refined over time. Perhaps most chillingly, Edmund expressed no remorse for his actions. While he could intellectually understand that what he had done was wrong, he seemed incapable of feeling genuine empathy for his victims. He spoke about them as objects rather than people, describing their murders with the same tone one might use to discuss a mechanical process or scientific experiment. The psychological evaluations conducted during this period revealed a complex individual who defied easy categorization. While Edmund clearly met the criteria for antisocial personality disorder, his case was complicated by his high intelligence, his apparent ability to form relationships with some people, and his willingness to cooperate with authorities. In November 1973, Kemper was found guilty of all 8 murders and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His case raised several questions about the nature of criminal responsibility and mental illness, as Kemper appeared to be fully aware of the heinous nature of his crimes. During his trial, Edmund's defense team attempted to argue for an insanity plea, but this was complicated by his obvious intelligence and his clear understanding of right and wrong. The prosecution argued that Edmund was a calculating killer who had chosen to commit his crimes and should be held fully responsible for his actions. The jury ultimately agreed with the prosecution, finding Edmund sane and guilty on all counts. The evidence presented during the trial painted a picture of a methodical, intelligent killer who had terrorized the Santa Cruz community for nearly a year while maintaining a facade of normalcy in his daily life. One of the most remarkable aspects of Edmund's case was his own request for the death penalty. Found sane and guilty at his trial in 1973, Kemper requested the death penalty for his crimes. This unusual request reflected Edmund's complex relationship with authority and control. Even in facing punishment for his crimes, he wanted to maintain some degree of agency in determining his fate. However, California had temporarily suspended capital punishment at the time of Edmund's trial, so instead of receiving the death sentence he had requested, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This sentence would ensure that Edmund would spend the rest of his life behind bars, unable to harm anyone else. The case of Edmund Kemper had profound and lasting impacts on law enforcement, psychology, and society as a whole. His crimes occurred during a period when the study of serial killers was still in its infancy, and his willingness to discuss his actions in detail provided researchers with invaluable insights into the criminal mind. The methodical nature of Edmund's crimes and his ability to evade capture while maintaining normal relationships challenged many existing assumptions about criminal behavior. Here was a killer who didn't fit the stereotypical image of a deranged madman. He was intelligent, articulate, and capable of appearing completely normal in social situations. The psychological studies conducted on Edmund contributed significantly to the development of criminal profiling techniques that are still used by law enforcement today. His case helped researchers understand how certain childhood experiences and psychological factors can contribute to the development of violent criminal behavior. The impact on the Santa Cruz community was equally profound. The knowledge that a serial killer had been living among them, socializing with police officers and maintaining normal relationships while secretly committing horrific murders, shattered the community's sense of safety and trust. The case served as a stark reminder that evil could hide behind a facade of normalcy. Edmund's crimes also highlighted the importance of thorough psychological evaluation and supervision of individuals released from mental health facilities. The fact that he had been deemed, cured, and released after murdering his grandparents, only to go on to kill 8 more people, raised serious questions about the mental health system's ability to predict and prevent future violence. The case influenced changes in how law enforcement agencies share information and coordinate investigations. The fact that Edmund had been able to commit multiple murders across different jurisdictions without being detected highlighted the need for better communication and cooperation between agencies. For the families of Edmund's victims, the case represented an unimaginable tragedy that would affect them for the rest of their lives. These were young women with bright futures ahead of them, students who were working toward degrees, daughters who were beloved by their families, and individuals who had their lives cut short by one man's twisted psychology. The media coverage of the case also contributed to changes in how serial killers were portrayed and discussed in popular culture. Edmund's articulate nature and willingness to discuss his crimes in detail made him a subject of fascination for journalists and documentary makers, but this attention also raised ethical questions about giving platforms to criminals. Today, more than 5 decades after his arrest, Edmund Kemper remains in prison, where he has become something of a model prisoner. He has participated in numerous interviews and studies, continuing to provide insights into his psychological makeup and criminal behavior. His case continues to be studied by criminologists, psychologists, and law enforcement professionals around the world. The story of Edmund Kemper serves as a chilling reminder of the capacity for evil that can exist within seemingly normal individuals. It challenges us to look beyond surface appearances and to understand the complex factors that can contribute to the development of violent criminal behavior. As we come to the end of this dark journey through the life and crimes of Edmund Kemper, we're left with more questions than answers about the nature of evil and the factors that can transform a human being into a monster. The case of the co-ed killer remains one of the most psychologically complex and disturbing in the annals of criminal history. Edmund Kemper's story is not just about one man's descent into madness and murder, it's about the fragility of human psychology and the devastating impact that abuse, neglect, and psychological trauma can have on a developing mind. It's about how intelligence and charm can be used as weapons, and how evil can hide behind a mask of normalcy. The young women who lost their lives to Edmund's twisted psychology, Mary Ann Pesci, Anita Luchessa, Aiko Koo, Cindy Schall, Rosalind Thorpe, Alice Liu, Clarnell Strandberg, and Sally Hallett, were more than just victims in a criminal case. They were individuals with hopes, dreams, and people who loved them. Their stories serve as a reminder of the human cost of violence and the ripple effects that crime has on families and communities. Today, Edmund Kemper remains imprisoned at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville, where he continues to serve his sentence of life without the possibility of parole. Now in his 70s, he has become an elderly man whose imposing physical presence has diminished with age, but whose crimes continue to fascinate and horrify those who study criminal psychology. His case continues to influence how we understand serial killers, how we investigate violent crimes, and how we attempt to predict and prevent future violence. The insights gained from studying Edmund's psychological makeup and criminal behavior have contributed to advances in criminal profiling, forensic psychology, and law enforcement techniques. But perhaps the most important lesson from Edmund Kemper's story is the need for vigilance, both in recognizing the warning signs of potential violence and in protecting the vulnerable members of our society. His crimes remind us that evil can lurk behind the most ordinary facades, and that we must remain alert to the signs that someone may be struggling with dangerous psychological impulses. The story of Edmund Kemper, the co-ed killer, stands as one of the most chilling chapters in the history of American crime. It's a story that continues to resonate decades later, serving as both a cautionary tale and a window into the darkest corners of the human psyche. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember the victims whose lives were cut short, and take comfort in the knowledge that monsters like Edmund Kemper are now behind bars, where they can no longer harm the innocent. Their stories live on as a reminder of the importance of justice, the resilience of the human spirit, and the ongoing fight against the darkness that sometimes dwells within us all. Please, if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe, so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. In the quiet coastal community of Gulf Breeze, Florida, where military families often settle to be close to Naval Air Station Pensacola, September 8, 2021, began like any other day. The morning sun cast long shadows across the suburban neighborhoods, and children prepared for another day of school. But in one home on a tree-lined street, a storm was brewing that would end in tragedy, captured forever in a chilling 911 call that would later become central evidence in a murder trial. This is the story of Colin James Turner, a 33-year-old retired Marine who had transitioned into the role of a devoted stay-at-home father, and his wife, Chief Petty Officer Bree Kristen Kuhn, a 34-year-old Navy chief whose military career was built on discipline and order. Their story reminds us that behind closed doors, even the most ordinary-seeming families can harbor darkness that ultimately consumes everything in its path. Colin Turner had served his country with honor as a United States Marine before stepping away from military life to focus on what mattered most to him, his family. After his service, he embraced the role of primary caregiver to his 3 children, a decision that reflected both his character and his commitment to being present in their lives. Those who knew Colin described him as a gentle soul who had found his purpose in fatherhood. He was the kind of man who attended every school function, knew the names of all his children's friends, and could be found on weekends coaching Little League or helping with homework at the kitchen table. His wife, Bree Kuhn, had chosen a different path. She had climbed the ranks in the Navy to become a chief petty officer, a position that demanded respect and carried significant responsibility. At NAS Pensacola, she was known for her professionalism and competence. To her colleagues, she appeared to have it all together: a successful military career, a family, and the respect of her peers. But the pressures of military life, combined with the complexities of marriage and parenthood, can create fissures that aren't always visible from the outside. The couple shared 3 children, and from the outside, they seemed to represent the American dream: a military family with a stable home, steady income, and a future full of possibilities. Colin had made the sacrifice many military spouses make. He had set aside his own career ambitions to provide stability for their children while Bree pursued her naval career. It's a dynamic that works for many military families, but it requires constant communication, mutual respect, and a shared vision of what they're building together. September 8, 2021, started early in the Turner-Kuhn household. Morning routines unfolded as they did in countless homes across America, children being prepared for school, breakfast being served, the daily choreography of a busy family getting ready to face the day. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, tensions were simmering that would soon boil over in the most tragic way imaginable. As the morning progressed, what began as a typical family disagreement began to escalate. The exact nature of their initial conflict may never be fully known, but court records and witness testimony would later reveal that their argument centered around their children, those 3 young lives who depended on both parents for love, stability, and security. Perhaps it was about discipline, school decisions, or the endless negotiations that parents engage in when they disagree about how to raise their children. What started as a discussion became an argument, and what began as an argument grew into something much more dangerous. By noon, the situation had deteriorated to the point where someone felt compelled to call 911. That first call came not from Colin, but from Bree herself. To the dispatcher, she likely sounded like a concerned wife dealing with a domestic situation that had gotten out of hand. She may have presented herself as the reasonable one, the one trying to de-escalate a volatile situation. The exact details of that first call remain part of the court record, but what we know is that when deputies arrived, they found a couple in the midst of a heated disagreement about their children. The responding officers did what they're trained to do in domestic situations. They separated the couple, listened to both sides of the story, and tried to mediate the dispute. They saw a Navy chief who appeared calm and in control, and a stay-at-home father who was clearly upset but not threatening violence. After speaking with both parties, the officers left, likely believing they had successfully de-escalated the situation. It's a scene that plays out thousands of times across America every day. Couples argue, police are called, and most of the time, cooler heads prevail. But in the Turner-Kuhn household, the departure of the police didn't bring peace. Instead, it may have created a false sense of security that allowed the underlying tensions to continue building pressure, like steam in a kettle with no release valve. As the afternoon wore on, whatever had caused the initial conflict remained unresolved. The children, those innocent victims whose well-being was ostensibly the subject of their parents' disagreement, were present in the home as the tension continued to mount. One can only imagine what those young minds were processing as they witnessed their parents, their sources of security and stability, engaged in an increasingly bitter conflict. The second 911 call came from Colin himself. By now, hours had passed since the first police visit, and whatever temporary calm had been achieved was clearly deteriorating. When the dispatcher answered Colin's call, they heard the voice of a man who was frustrated, possibly frightened, and certainly at his wits' end. He was calling because the situation in his home had once again spiraled beyond his ability to manage. When officers responded to this second call, they found a scene that was notably more tense than their earlier visit. Body camera footage from this response would later be shown to the jury during Bree's murder trial, providing a window into the escalating drama that was unfolding in real time. The officers again attempted to mediate, speaking separately with both Colin and Bree, trying to understand what was driving this ongoing conflict and how they might help resolve it. What the officers couldn't have known was that they were witnessing the final hours of Colin Turner's life. The man they saw on their body cameras, frustrated, seeking help, trying to protect his children from the chaos that was consuming his household, had less than 2 hours left to live. And the woman they spoke with, the Navy chief who held a position of trust and responsibility in our nation's military, was hours away from committing an act that would destroy not just Colin's life, but her own future and the stability of their 3 children. After this second visit, the officers again left, likely hoping that their intervention had been successful. In their experience, multiple calls to the same address weren't unusual, and many domestic situations require several police visits before they're fully resolved. They had no way of knowing that their next response to this address would be to investigate a homicide. What happened in the Turner-Coon home during those final hours remains largely between Colin and Bree, with only their children as witnesses to events that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. We can piece together fragments from court testimony, the timeline of events established by investigators, and the physical evidence found at the scene, but the emotional truth of those last hours, the fear, the anger, the desperation that must have filled that house, can only be imagined. What we know is that by early evening, the situation had escalated beyond anything the couple had experienced before. Whatever boundaries had previously existed in their relationship had been crossed. The argument that had begun hours earlier about their children had metastasized into something far more dangerous, something that would require a third call to 911. During this time, Colin may have realized that his wife was beyond reasoning with. Perhaps he began to fear not just for his own safety, but for the safety of their children. As a former Marine, he would have been trained to assess threats and respond appropriately, but domestic violence creates a unique kind of danger because it comes from someone you love, someone you share a bed with, someone who knows all your vulnerabilities. Bree, for her part, was clearly in the grip of something that had overwhelmed her ability to think clearly. Whether it was rage, desperation, mental illness, or some combination of factors, she was no longer the composed Navy chief who had built a successful military career through discipline and self-control. Something had snapped, and the consequences would be irreversible. As evening approached, Colin found himself in a situation that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier. His wife, the mother of his children, his partner in building a life together, had become a threat. And in what would be his final act, he did what he had done twice already that day. He reached for the phone to call 911. At approximately 6 p.m. on September 8, 2021, Colin Turner made his final 911 call. The dispatcher who answered had no way of knowing they were about to witness a murder in real time, that the voice on the other end of the line belonged to a man with just minutes left to live. Colin's voice, captured forever in that recording, was calm but urgent as he explained his situation to the dispatcher. "She locked me in the garage," he said, referring to his wife. The dispatcher, trained to gather information quickly and efficiently, began asking the questions that would help responding officers understand what they were walking into. But as Colin spoke, explaining his predicament with the measured tone of a man trying to remain rational in an irrational situation, something was happening on the other side of that garage door. Bree had made a decision that would change everything. She had crossed a line from which there could be no return. In the last call, Turner told the dispatcher that Coon had locked him in the garage. Police said there was an audible gunshot. That sound, sharp, final, unmistakable, cut through Colin's words and changed the nature of the call from a domestic dispute to a homicide in progress. The dispatcher, suddenly thrust into every emergency operator's worst nightmare, continued trying to maintain contact, following protocols designed for exactly this kind of situation. But there was no response from Colin. The line remained open, but the voice that had been calmly seeking help just moments before was gone forever. What happened in those final seconds remains a matter of forensic evidence and courtroom testimony. The medical examiner told the jury Turner died from 4 gunshot entry wounds to the back, which all exited from his chest. This wasn't a crime of passion with a single shot fired in the heat of the moment. This was a deliberate, methodical execution of a trapped man who was seeking help from law enforcement. The children, those 3 innocent souls whose well-being had supposedly been the source of their parents' conflict, were in the house when their father was murdered. In a single moment, they lost both parents, one to death, the other to a life sentence in prison. The very argument about their welfare had culminated in the destruction of their family. When officers responded to that third 911 call, they arrived expecting to find another domestic dispute requiring their intervention. Instead, they found a crime scene that would haunt them for years to come. Colin Turner, the retired Marine who had spent his final years devoted to his children, lay dead in the garage of his own home, killed by the woman who had promised to love and protect him. Santa Rosa County Sheriff Bob Johnson said during a press conference that 34-year-old Colin James Turner called 911 just before his death, calling the case very sad, an understatement that reflected the profound tragedy that had unfolded in their jurisdiction. The arrest of Bree Kuhn sent shockwaves through the military community at NAS Pensacola. Her colleagues struggled to reconcile the competent, professional Navy chief they knew with the woman who had just committed such a heinous act. In the military, trust is everything. You depend on your fellow service members with your life, and the idea that one of their own was capable of such calculated violence was deeply disturbing. The investigation that followed painted a picture of a marriage that had been deteriorating for some time, though the full extent of their problems had been hidden from public view. The couple's 3 children were at home at the time of the killing, adding another layer of tragedy to an already incomprehensible crime. As news of the murder spread through Gulf Breeze and the wider Pensacola area, friends, neighbors, and fellow parents struggled to understand how a family that had seemed so normal could have harbored such darkness. It was a reminder that domestic violence doesn't discriminate based on education, profession, or social status, and that the most dangerous place for many people is their own home. The case against Bree Kuhn was built around compelling evidence that left little room for doubt about what had happened that September evening. The 9/11 recording, with its chilling conclusion, provided prosecutors with perhaps the most powerful piece of evidence possible, a real-time documentation of the murder as it occurred. During the trial, Kuhn claimed she fatally shot her husband in self-defense, with her lawyers arguing for a battered spouse syndrome defense. This legal strategy attempted to portray Bree as a victim of domestic abuse who had finally reached a breaking point and acted to protect herself. It's a defense that has been successful in some cases where there's clear evidence of ongoing abuse and an imminent threat to the defendant's life. However, the physical evidence told a different story. The medical examiner told the jury Turner died from 4 gunshot entry wounds to the back, which all exited from his chest. This forensic evidence was devastating to the self-defense claim. It's difficult to argue that someone posed an imminent threat when they were shot multiple times in the back while locked in a garage and seeking help from police. Chief Petty Officer Bree Kristen Kuhn, 37, was convicted of the first-degree premeditated murder of Colin James Turner. The jury's verdict reflected their conclusion that this wasn't a crime of passion or self-defense, but a calculated act of murder that had been planned and executed deliberately. After deliberating for more than 4 hours, the jury reached a verdict in Bree Kuhn's trial. For many observers, the length of deliberation seemed surprisingly long given the strength of the evidence, but juries take their responsibility seriously, particularly in cases where someone's life hangs in the balance. The conviction brought a measure of legal justice for Colin Turner, but it could never restore the life that had been so brutally taken or heal the wounds inflicted on his children. Justice, in cases like this, is an imperfect remedy for an irreparable harm. While Bree Kuhn received the life sentence that the jury determined she deserved, the true tragedy of this case lies in the innocent victims whose lives were forever altered by her actions. The oldest daughter currently lives with her natural father, and the remaining 2 children live with Turner's parents, an arrangement that speaks to the broader devastation caused by domestic violence. These children, who should have been preparing for school dances, soccer practices, and family vacations, instead found themselves navigating the complex trauma of losing both parents in a single, violent moment. They would grow up knowing that their mother had murdered their father, a burden that no child should ever have to carry. Colin's parents, who should have been enjoying their golden years and spoiling their grandchildren, instead found themselves thrust into the role of primary caregivers, trying to provide stability and love while processing their own grief and trauma. They had lost their son in the most violent way imaginable, and now they carried the additional responsibility of raising his children and helping them understand an incomprehensible tragedy. The impact of domestic violence extends far beyond the immediate victim and perpetrator. It ripples outward, affecting grandparents, siblings, friends, colleagues, and entire communities. In the case of the Turner-Coon family, 3 children lost their innocence, grandparents lost their son, and a community lost its sense of security. In the aftermath of tragedies like this, we naturally seek explanations that might help us understand how such violence can occur. What causes a person to cross the line from argument to murder? What transforms a Navy chief, trained in discipline and self-control, into someone capable of executing her husband while he pleads for help? The truth is that domestic violence is complex and multifaceted, involving psychological, social, and environmental factors that can combine in dangerous ways. While we may never fully understand what drove Bree Coon to commit such a horrific act, we can learn from cases like this to better recognize warning signs and intervene before disagreements escalate into violence. The multiple 911 calls that preceded the murder suggest a pattern of escalating conflict that might have been interrupted with different interventions. Police were called multiple times during the couple's altercation over 6 hours in the afternoon, creating several opportunities for a different outcome. This case also highlights the particular vulnerabilities faced by stay-at-home parents, who may become isolated from support networks and financially dependent on their partners. Colin Turner had made the admirable choice to prioritize his children's needs over his own career advancement, but this decision may have also placed him in a position of vulnerability when his marriage began to deteriorate. The military context adds another layer of complexity. Military families face unique stresses, including deployments, frequent moves, and the hierarchical nature of military culture. These factors don't excuse violence, but they may contribute to the pressures that can destabilize a family. Since her conviction and sentence, Coon has been housed at the Lowell Correctional Institution in Ocala, Florida, where she will likely spend the rest of her life. The woman who once held a position of trust and authority in the United States Navy now lives in a prison cell, her life defined not by her years of military service, but by the few minutes it took her to destroy her family. For Bree Coon, there are no more mornings with her children, no more family dinners, no more opportunities to watch them grow up and achieve their dreams. She made a choice in a moment of rage or desperation that cost her everything: her freedom, her children, her future, and her identity as anything other than a convicted murderer. Meanwhile, Colin Turner's children continue their journey through childhood and adolescence without their father. They attend school, play with friends, and navigate the ordinary challenges of growing up, but they do so carrying an extraordinary burden. They are survivors of domestic violence, witnesses to unthinkable trauma, and living reminders of both the fragility and resilience of the human spirit. The community of Gulf Breeze and the military families at NAS Pensacola have moved forward as well, but cases like this leave lasting scars. They serve as stark reminders that domestic violence can happen anywhere, to anyone, and that the consequences extend far beyond the immediate victims. The murder of Colin Turner offers no easy answers or comfortable conclusions. It stands as a stark reminder that domestic violence can escalate rapidly and unpredictably, that multiple warning signs were present but not effectively addressed, and that children are often the hidden victims of their parents' conflicts. Perhaps the most important lesson we can draw from this tragedy is the critical importance of taking domestic disputes seriously, even when they involve seemingly stable, successful families. The 3 911 calls that preceded Colin's murder represented 3 opportunities for intervention, 3 chances to break the cycle of escalation that ultimately proved fatal. For law enforcement, this case underscores the challenges of domestic violence calls and the difficulty of predicting when a situation might turn deadly. The officers who responded to those first 2 calls followed protocol and did their best to de-escalate the situation, but they were dealing with forces they couldn't fully see or understand. For military communities, Colin Turner's death highlights the need for better support systems for families dealing with stress, conflict, and mental health challenges. The military's emphasis on strength and self-reliance can sometimes prevent people from seeking help when they need it most. For all of us, this case serves as a reminder that domestic violence is a community problem that requires community solutions. It's not enough to simply respond after violence occurs. We need better systems for prevention, intervention, and support for families in crisis. As we reach the end of this tragic story, it's important to remember Colin Turner not just as a victim of domestic violence, but as a man who chose love over career advancement, who prioritized his children's needs above his own ambitions, and who spent his final moments seeking help rather than revenge. Colin Turner was 33 years old when his life was cut short. He had served his country as a Marine, dedicated himself to his family as a father, and faced his final crisis with the same calm courage that had characterized his military service. He deserved to see his children graduate, to walk his daughters down the aisle, to become a grandfather, and to grow old surrounded by the family he loved so much. Instead, his story became a cautionary tale about the dangers that can lurk within seemingly ordinary families, a reminder that domestic violence claims lives across all social and economic boundaries, and a testament to the courage it takes to seek help even when that help comes too late. In the quiet moments before sleep, when we reflect on the stories that shape our understanding of human nature, the murder of Colin Turner stands as both a tragedy and a warning. It reminds us to cherish the peaceful moments with our loved ones, to seek help when conflicts arise, and to never take for granted the simple blessing of a safe home. The Turner-Coon family story ended in a garage in Gulf Breeze, Florida, with a 911 call that captured the final moments of a father's life. But their story also continues in the lives of 3 children who must find their way forward despite the unthinkable loss they've endured, and in the lessons their tragedy teaches about the precious fragility of the families we build and the devastating consequences when love turns to violence. As we close this chapter on the murder of Colin Turner, we remember a father who died seeking help, children who survived unimaginable trauma, and a community forever changed by one moment of lethal rage. His story joins the countless others that remind us that justice is not the same as restoration, that some wounds never fully heal, and that the most ordinary days can transform without warning into the stuff of nightmares. In the end, perhaps the greatest tribute we can pay to Colin Turner's memory is to remember that behind every true crime story lies a real person who loved and was loved, who had dreams and fears and hopes for the future. He was more than just a victim, he was a father, a son, a former Marine, and a man whose life mattered in ways that extend far beyond the tragic circumstances of his death. Please, I'm just putting it out there, if you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our 4th story. Story 4. In the ancient Italian city of Perugia, where cobblestone streets wind through medieval architecture and the university has welcomed students for over 700 years, a young woman's dreams were cut tragically short on a November evening in 2007. This is the story of Meredith Kircher, a 21-year-old British student whose murder would become one of the most controversial and internationally scrutinized criminal cases of the modern era. Meredith Susanna Cara Kircher was born into a loving family in South London, growing up in the quiet suburb of Colston in Surrey. From an early age, Meredith displayed the kind of infectious enthusiasm for life that drew people to her like moths to a warm flame. Those who knew her described her as witty, intelligent, and genuinely caring, the type of person who remembered birthdays, asked about your day, and meant it when she asked. At the University of Leeds, where she pursued European studies, Meredith excelled academically while maintaining close friendships. Her professors noted her sharp analytical mind and her particular gift for languages. She spoke fluent Italian and was improving her French, harboring dreams of one day working for the European Union or perhaps as a journalist covering international affairs. These weren't idle fantasies. Meredith approached her ambitions with the same methodical determination she brought to everything else in her life. The opportunity to study abroad in Italy through the Erasmus exchange program seemed like destiny calling. Perugia, with its prestigious university for foreigners and its position as a cultural crossroads, offered everything Meredith was seeking. She arrived in late September 2007, settling into courses in modern history, political theory, and the history of cinema. Her professors would later remember her as engaged and thoughtful, always prepared for class discussions. The cottage at 7 Via della Pergola where Meredith chose to live was typical of student accommodations in Perugia, a two-story house with thick stone walls that had probably sheltered residents for centuries. The location was perfect, just a short walk up the hill to the university and down into the heart of the medieval city center. She shared this space with 3 other young women, 2 Italian students, Filomena Mazzetti and Laura Mazzetti, who were actually cousins, and an American student from Seattle named Amanda Knox. Amanda had arrived in Perugia around the same time as Meredith, though their paths to Italy were quite different. Where Meredith was focused and academically driven, Amanda seemed more interested in the experiential aspects of living abroad. She was learning Italian, working part-time at a local bar called La Chic, and had quickly begun a relationship with Raffaele Solicito, a 23-year-old Italian computer science student she'd met just a week before the events that would change all their lives forever. The dynamics in the house were generally peaceful, though not without the typical tensions that arise when young people from different cultures share living space. Meredith was known to be tidier than her housemates and occasionally grew frustrated with the casual approach others took to cleaning and household responsibilities. She had expressed some concerns to friends about Amanda's lifestyle, the late nights, the casual approach to security, leaving doors unlocked. But these were minor irritations, the kind that time and communication usually resolve. Thursday, November 1, 2007, was All Saints' Day in Italy, a national holiday that meant most businesses were closed and students had a day off from classes. Meredith spent a quiet day at the cottage, catching up on reading and enjoying the unseasonably warm autumn weather. That evening, she made plans to have dinner with her British friends at the house of Amy Frost, another English student studying in Perugia. The dinner party was exactly the kind of evening Meredith enjoyed most: good food, intelligent conversation, and the comfortable company of friends who shared her cultural background and academic interests. They discussed their courses, their experiences living in Italy, and their plans for the approaching weekend. Meredith was in good spirits, laughing frequently and participating actively in the conversation. She mentioned that she was looking forward to a quiet weekend, planning to catch up on some reading and perhaps explore more of Perugia's historic sites. As the evening progressed, the group watched a DVD of the film, The Notebook, sharing popcorn and settling into the kind of relaxed domesticity that helps ease homesickness for students living abroad. Meredith seemed completely at ease, curled up on the sofa with her friends, occasionally commenting on the film or joining in when the conversation drifted to other topics. Around 8:45 p.m., Meredith made the decision to head home. Her friends offered to accompany her. The walk from Amy's house to Via della Pergola wasn't particularly long, but it did involve some isolated stretches through Perugia's winding medieval streets. Meredith politely declined their offers. She was a sensible young woman who had been living in the city for over a month. She knew the routes well, felt comfortable navigating them alone, and it was still relatively early in the evening. The last confirmed sighting of Meredith Kircher alive was at approximately 9 p.m., as she walked alone toward her house on Via della Pergola. A neighbor reported seeing a young woman matching her description walking up the street with purposeful steps, her bag slung over her shoulder, looking like any student heading home for the evening. What happened next would become the subject of intense speculation, conflicting testimonies, and years of legal battles. Amanda Knox later stated that she spent that evening with Raffaele Solicito at his apartment, about a 15-minute walk from the cottage. According to their initial statements, they had dinner together, watched a film, smoked marijuana, and spent an intimate evening together before Amanda returned to Via della Pergola the following morning. However, their stories about that night would prove to be inconsistent and would change multiple times during police questioning. Initially, Amanda claimed she had returned to the cottage that evening to shower and change clothes, leaving again to spend the night at Raphael's apartment. Later versions of events eliminated this return visit. Raphael's account of their activities that evening also contained discrepancies and changes that would become crucial to the investigation. Meanwhile, in the cottage on Via della Pergola, Meredith's evening was coming to a violent end. The forensic evidence would later suggest that she returned home, probably around 9:15 p.m., and went to her room. She may have begun changing for bed or preparing to settle in for the night when she was attacked. Friday morning, November 2nd, dawned clear and crisp in Perugia. Amanda Knox later said she arrived at the cottage around 10:30 a.m. to shower and change clothes. She would claim to have found the front door open, which she initially thought was odd but not alarming. Their housemate sometimes left doors open, and Amanda knew Meredith had been out the evening before. But as Amanda moved through the house, she began to notice things that seemed increasingly wrong. There were drops of blood in the bathroom, small spots on the sink and bath mat that seemed fresh. The larger bathroom was in disarray, with broken glass from what appeared to be a window having been smashed from the inside. These details would later become central to the investigation, with questions arising about the size and pattern of the blood drops and the nature of the damage to the bathroom window. Amanda's actions during this discovery would become another point of intense scrutiny. She took a shower, according to her later testimony, despite the presence of blood in the bathroom. She then gathered some clean clothes and returned to Raphael's apartment, where she informed him of what she had found. Together, they decided to return to the cottage to investigate further. By the time they arrived back at Via della Pergola, it was approaching noon. They found Meredith's bedroom door locked, which was unusual. Meredith typically left her door open when she wasn't in the room. They called out to her but received no response. Amanda tried calling Meredith's cell phones. She carried both an Italian phone and her British mobile, but the calls went to voicemail. It was around this time that the postal police arrived at the cottage. They had come to return Meredith's phones, which had been found discarded in a garden about a kilometer away from the house. The discovery of the phones had prompted them to trace the registered address, leading them to Via della Pergola just as Amanda and Raphael were trying to determine whether something was seriously wrong. The timing of this convergence, Amanda and Raphael at the house when the police arrived with the phones, would later become a significant element in the investigation. Amanda's behavior during the interaction with police was noted as being unusual. While Raphael appeared tense and nervous, Amanda was described as seeming almost carefree, kissing and embracing Raphael, appearing to stretch and yawn in a way that struck the officers as inappropriate given the circumstances. When Meredith's Italian housemates, Philomena and Laura, arrived at the cottage and learned about the locked bedroom door and the discovered phones, they immediately recognized the seriousness of the situation. Unlike Amanda, who had seemed relatively unconcerned about the locked door, the Italian students insisted that it was completely out of character for Meredith to lock her door and not respond to calls and knocks. The decision was made to break down the door to Meredith's room. What they found inside would sear itself into the memories of everyone present and launch one of the most complex and controversial criminal investigations in recent European history. Meredith Kircher lay on the floor of her bedroom, partially covered by a duvet that someone had placed over her body. She was partially clothed, wearing only a long-sleeved shirt and a bra that had been cut. Her throat had been slashed with what appeared to be a sharp knife, and there were signs that she had fought desperately against her attacker. The medical examination would later reveal that she had suffered multiple knife wounds and that there was evidence suggesting sexual assault. The room itself told a story of violence and struggle. Furniture was overturned, personal belongings were scattered across the floor, and there were signs of a fierce fight for life. Blood evidence would later show that Meredith had been mobile for some time after receiving her fatal wound, moving around the room before finally collapsing near the wardrobe where her body was found. Perhaps most chillingly, the forensic evidence suggested that Meredith had not died quickly. The nature of her wound, while ultimately fatal, would have allowed her to survive for several minutes. During those final moments of her life, she may have been aware of what was happening to her, may have continued to struggle against her attacker, may have called out for help that never came. The Perugia police, led by Chief Inspector Monica Napoleoni and Prosecutor Giuliano Mignini, immediately launched a full-scale murder investigation. The cottage was sealed as a crime scene, and forensic teams began the painstaking work of documenting every piece of potential evidence. What they found would generate months of analysis, debate, and conflicting interpretations. In addition to the obvious signs of struggle in Meredith's room, investigators discovered a number of puzzling elements throughout the house. The bathroom window that Amanda had mentioned appeared to have been broken from the inside, with glass scattered in a pattern that seemed inconsistent with an intruder breaking in from outside. There was no clear path from the window to Meredith's room that wouldn't have disturbed other areas of the house. The blood evidence was complex and, according to various forensic experts, potentially crucial. In addition to the obvious blood in Meredith's room, small amounts of blood were found in other parts of the house, including the bathroom Amanda said she had used that morning. The pattern and DNA composition of these traces would become the subject of extensive forensic analysis and courtroom debate. From the beginning, the investigation focused heavily on the people who had been present at the cottage that morning, Amanda Knox and Rafael Solicito. Their behavior, both during the discovery of the body and in subsequent police questioning, struck investigators as suspicious. Amanda's demeanor, described by police as too calm, too detached from the gravity of the situation, contrasted sharply with the visible distress shown by Meredith's Italian housemates. In the days following the discovery of Meredith's body, both Amanda and Rafael were brought in for extensive police questioning. These interrogations would become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case, with fundamental disagreements about what was said, how it was said, and under what conditions. Amanda, who spoke Italian but was not fully fluent, underwent hours of questioning without the benefit of a lawyer or official interpreter. She would later claim that the interrogation was intense and psychologically coercive, with officers shouting at her, calling her a liar, and pressuring her to remember details that she insisted she couldn't recall. The police, conversely, maintained that their questioning was professional and within normal boundaries. During one of these late-night interrogation sessions, Amanda made statements that would fundamentally alter the direction of the investigation. She implicated Patrick Lumumba, the Congolese owner of the bar where she worked part-time, suggesting that he had been at the cottage on the night of the murder and might have been involved in Meredith's death. This accusation led to Lumumba's immediate arrest, despite his having a solid alibi for the evening in question. The statement implicating Lumumba was later deemed a false confession, and Amanda would eventually be convicted of slander for making these accusations. But the damage was done. Her willingness to point the finger at her employer under pressure raised serious questions about her credibility and her possible knowledge of what had actually occurred that night. Raphael's interrogations revealed a different kind of problem. His story about the evening of November 1st proved to be inconsistent and changed during questioning. Initially supporting Amanda's version of events, he later seemed to distance himself from her account, at one point suggesting that she had left his apartment that evening and he wasn't sure what time she had returned. While Amanda and Raphael were being questioned, forensic analysis of the crime scene was yielding a significant lead. DNA evidence found in Meredith's room and on her body pointed to a third individual, Rudy Herman Guide, a 20-year-old drifter originally from the Ivory Coast who had been living in Perugia for several years. Guide was known to local police as a small-time criminal with a history of break-ins and petty theft. He had been caught in the past entering homes and businesses illegally, sometimes using bathrooms or kitchens in houses where he didn't belong. His fingerprints were on file with authorities, and his DNA was in the system from previous arrests. When the forensic evidence pointed to Guide, he was already in Germany, having left Perugia shortly after the murder. He was arrested on a European warrant and extradited back to Italy, where he initially denied any involvement in Meredith's death. However, faced with the overwhelming physical evidence linking him to the crime scene, Gide eventually admitted to having been in the cottage on the night of the murder. Gide's version of events, however, differed dramatically from what prosecutors believed had occurred. He claimed that he had arranged to meet Meredith that evening, that they had engaged in consensual intimate contact, and that he had been in the bathroom when he heard Meredith scream. According to his account, he emerged to find a struggle in progress between Meredith and an unknown assailant, and he fled in fear without trying to help her. This story was met with skepticism by investigators, prosecutors, and ultimately by the courts. The forensic evidence suggested a much more violent encounter, and Gide's own statements contained inconsistencies and implausible elements. Most damaging to his credibility was his initial flight from the country and his failure to report the crime or seek help for Meredith if he had indeed witnessed her being attacked by someone else. As the investigation progressed, prosecutors developed a theory of the crime that would prove to be deeply controversial and would ultimately struggle to withstand scrutiny in various courts. According to prosecutor McNeely and his team, the murder of Meredith Kircher was not a simple break-in gone wrong or even a straightforward sexual assault by a single perpetrator. Instead, they theorized that Meredith had been killed as the result of a group sexual assault involving Amanda Knox, Rafael Solicito, and Rudy Gide. According to this theory, Amanda had developed resentment toward Meredith over household tensions and lifestyle differences. On the evening of November 1st, the prosecution argued, Amanda and Rafael had returned to the cottage with Gide, and the three had attempted to involve Meredith in some kind of sexual activity. When Meredith resisted and tried to fight them off, the situation escalated to violence. The prosecution suggested that Amanda had been the one to deliver the fatal knife wound, driven by a combination of sexual frustration, drugs, and anger at her British housemate. The staged break-in through the bathroom window was, according to this theory, a clumsy attempt by Amanda and Rafael to create an alternative explanation for the crime. This theory, which became known as the group sex game gone wrong scenario, was supported by some forensic evidence but required a complex interpretation of the crime scene and the various witness statements. It also demanded acceptance of the idea that Amanda Knox, a young American student with no history of violence, had participated in and possibly led a brutal sexual assault and murder. The defense teams for both Amanda and Rafael rejected this theory entirely. They argued that the forensic evidence was contaminated, misinterpreted, or insufficient to support such a complex conspiracy. They pointed out that Rudy Gide had a clear history of break-ins and sexual assault, that his DNA was found definitively at the crime scene, and that there was no credible evidence linking their clients to the actual act of violence against Meredith. The legal proceedings that followed would span nearly 8 years and would involve multiple trials, appeals, convictions, and acquittals. The complexity of the Italian legal system, combined with the international attention focused on the case, created a legal and media circus that often seemed to overshadow the fundamental question of what had actually happened to Meredith Kircher. Rudy Gide, facing the clearest forensic evidence against him, opted for a fast-track trial procedure that offered the possibility of a reduced sentence in exchange for a quicker resolution. In September 2008, he was convicted of sexual assault and murder and was sentenced to 30 years in prison. This sentence was later reduced to 16 years on appeal, and Gide was eventually released in 2021 after serving 13 years. Crucially, even while accepting the reduced sentence, Gide maintained that Amanda and Rafael had been present and involved in the crime. His testimony became a key element in the prosecution's case against the two remaining defendants, even though it was clearly in Gide's interest to deflect full responsibility for the murder onto others. The trial of Amanda Knox and Rafael Solicito began in January 2009 and immediately became an international sensation. The combination of a pretty young American defendant, a brutal crime in a picturesque Italian setting, and salacious theories about sex games and drug-fueled violence proved irresistible to media outlets around the world. Amanda Knox, in particular, became a figure of intense fascination and polarized opinion. Supporters saw her as a naive young woman caught in a nightmare scenario, prosecuted by a system that relied on prejudice and faulty forensic science. Critics viewed her behavior and statements as evidence of guilt, pointing to her apparent lack of appropriate emotional response and the inconsistencies in her various accounts of the night in question. The prosecution presented their case with confidence, arguing that the combination of forensic evidence, witness testimony, and the defendant's own contradictory statements proved guilt beyond reasonable doubt. They walked the jury through their theory of the crime, using crime scene photographs, DNA evidence, and the testimony of various experts to build their narrative of a group assault that had ended in murder. The defense, led by experienced Italian attorneys working with international experts, systematically challenged every element of the prosecution's case. They brought in their own forensic experts to question the handling and interpretation of DNA evidence. They presented alternative theories of the crime that focused solely on Rudy Guede as the perpetrator. They argued that their clients had been the victims of a rushed investigation that had focused on convenient suspects rather than following the evidence wherever it led. In December 2009, after deliberating for 11 hours, the jury delivered guilty verdicts against both Amanda Knox and Rafael Solicito. Amanda was sentenced to 26 years in prison, while Rafael received 25 years. The courtroom erupted as the verdicts were read, with Amanda breaking down in tears and Rafael staring in apparent disbelief. The convictions sent shockwaves through the international community, particularly in the United States where public opinion had increasingly turned in favor of Amanda Knox's innocence. American media coverage had been largely sympathetic to Knox, portraying her as a victim of an archaic and possibly corrupt Italian justice system. The guilty verdicts seemed to confirm the worst fears of those who saw the case as a miscarriage of justice. Italian reaction was more mixed but generally supportive of the court's decision. Many Italians felt that the American media had been unfairly critical of their legal system and had ignored evidence that seemed to point toward Knox's involvement in the crime. The cultural differences in how the case was perceived became almost as significant as the legal questions about guilt and innocence. For the Kircher family, the convictions brought a measure of closure but not peace. Meredith's mother, Arlene, and her siblings had maintained a dignified presence throughout the trial, focusing on their desire to see justice for Meredith rather than engaging in the media circus surrounding the case. They had consistently stated their belief that the Italian authorities were competent to handle the investigation and prosecution, and they expressed satisfaction with the guilty verdicts. Under Italian law, the convictions were not final until they had been upheld through the appeals process. Both Amanda and Rafael immediately appealed their convictions, setting in motion a legal process that would consume several more years and would ultimately overturn the original verdicts. The appeals process revealed significant problems with some of the forensic evidence that had been central to the original convictions. Independent experts appointed by the appeals court found that DNA evidence on a knife found at Rafael's apartment, which the prosecution had argued was the murder weapon, was too degraded and contaminated to be reliable. Similarly, DNA evidence on Meredith's bra clasp that had been attributed to Rafael was deemed unreliable due to possible contamination during the collection process. These forensic revelations were devastating to the prosecution's case. Without the DNA evidence linking Amanda and Rafael directly to the crime scene, the case relied heavily on circumstantial evidence, behavioral interpretations, and the testimony of Rudy Guede, hardly a reliable witness given his own conviction for the same crime. In October 2011, the appeals court overturned both convictions, finding that the evidence was insufficient to support guilty verdicts beyond reasonable doubt. Amanda Knox and Rafael Solicito were released immediately, with Amanda returning to the United States within hours of her release. The acquittals were met with celebration from Knox's supporters but with dismay from those who believed she and Solicito were guilty. The Kircher family expressed disappointment with the decision, feeling that justice for Meredith had been denied. The legal saga was not over, however. Italian prosecutors appealed the acquittals to the Supreme Court, which ordered a new trial in 2013. This created the bizarre situation of Amanda Knox being retried for murder while living freely in Seattle, with the Italian courts requesting her extradition if convicted again. The retrial, conducted largely in Knox's absence, resulted in another conviction in 2014. However, this conviction was based on many of the same evidentiary problems that had troubled the first trial. The forensic evidence remained questionable, the circumstantial case remained weak, and the fundamental theory of the crime continued to strain credibility. Finally, in March 2015, the Italian Supreme Court definitively acquitted both Amanda Knox and Raffaele Solicito of the murder charges. In a detailed written decision, the court found that the evidence was insufficient to support convictions and that the prosecution had failed to prove their theory of the crime. The acquittals were final and could not be appealed further. The Supreme Court did uphold Knox's conviction for slander related to her false accusation of Patrick Lumumba, but this was a relatively minor charge that carried a sentence she had already served during her initial imprisonment. Today, nearly 17 years after Meredith Kercher's murder, the case continues to generate debate and discussion. Rudy Gied served his sentence and was released from prison in 2021. Amanda Knox has written a memoir, given numerous interviews, and become an advocate for criminal justice reform. Raffaele Solicito has also written about his experiences and has largely tried to rebuild his life away from public attention. For many observers, the case represents a troubling example of how confirmation bias, media pressure, and flawed forensic science can lead to wrongful convictions. The initial focus on Amanda Knox and Raffaele Solicito, based largely on their behavior and inconsistent statements rather than solid physical evidence, may have prevented a more thorough investigation of other possibilities. Others maintain that the acquittals were the result of successful defense strategies that cast doubt on valid evidence, and that Knox and Solicito escaped justice through skilled legal maneuvering and international pressure. These observers point to the defendants' changing stories, their presence at the scene, and various circumstantial evidence as continuing to suggest their involvement in the crime. The forensic evidence, which was supposed to provide scientific certainty, ultimately raised more questions than it answered. The handling of the crime scene, the collection and analysis of DNA evidence, and the interpretation of various physical traces all became subjects of intense dispute between competing experts. The case highlighted the limitations of forensic science and the importance of proper protocols in evidence collection and analysis. In all the years of trials, appeals, media coverage, and public debate, it's important not to lose sight of the young woman whose life was cut short on that November evening in Perugia. Meredith Kercher was not just a victim in a famous criminal case, she was a daughter, a sister, a friend, and a bright young woman with dreams and aspirations that will never be fulfilled. Those who knew Meredith remember her warmth, her intelligence, and her enthusiasm for life. She had chosen to study abroad because she wanted to experience different cultures, to broaden her horizons, and to prepare herself for a career in international affairs. She was doing exactly what young people are supposed to do, exploring the world, learning about themselves, and building the foundation for their adult lives. The cottage on Via della Pergola, where Meredith spent her final weeks, has since been demolished. The University of Leeds established a scholarship in her memory for students wishing to study abroad. Her family has worked to keep her memory alive not as a victim of a famous crime, but as the vibrant young woman she was. The streets of Perugia continue to wind through their medieval pathways, and students still come from around the world to study in this beautiful city. But for those who remember the events of November 2007, there will always be a shadow over the ancient stones, a reminder of how quickly life can change, how precious safety is, and how the search for justice can become as complex and troubling as the crimes that demand it. The murder of Meredith Kercher remains, in many ways, an unsolved puzzle. We know who struck the fatal blow. Rudy Gied's guilt has never been seriously questioned. But the circumstances surrounding that fatal encounter, the question of whether others were involved, and the broader lessons to be learned from this case continue to be debated. What seems certain is that on a November night in 2007, a young woman with her whole life ahead of her was killed in a violent attack that shocked a quiet university town and ultimately captured the attention of the world. Everything that followed, the investigations, the trials, the media coverage, the international controversy, grew out of that single, tragic moment when Meredith Kircher's promising future was stolen from her forever. In the end, perhaps the most important thing to remember is not the legal complexities or the media circus or the questions about guilt and innocence, but simply this: a young woman died too soon, far from home, and the world lost whatever contributions she might have made to it. That loss, regardless of all the other controversies surrounding this case, is the one thing that can never be appealed, never be overturned, and never be undone. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. We'll journey into one of Alabama's most haunting unsolved mysteries. This is the story of Heaven Lachey Ross, an 11-year-old girl whose vibrant life was cut tragically short on a seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning in August 2003. It's a case that has puzzled investigators for over 2 decades, leaving a family searching for answers and a community forever changed. Heaven Lachey Ross was born on June 10, 1992, in the small city of Northport, Alabama. Her family called her Shay, a nickname that seemed to capture her spirited personality perfectly. At 11 years old, Shay was everything you'd expect from a girl on the cusp of adolescence: energetic, curious, and full of dreams about her future. Shay lived with her mother, Beth Thompson, and her stepfather, Kevin Thompson, in the Willowbrook Mobile Home Park. It was a modest community where neighbors knew each other's names and children played freely in the yards between the trailers. Shay was an outdoorsy child who loved music and sports, often seen riding her bike around the neighborhood or playing with friends in the warm Alabama summers. The Willowbrook Trailer Park sat nestled in Northport, a city that sits across the Black Warrior River from Tuscaloosa. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where children walk to school bus stops without a second thought, and where the biggest worries are usually about homework and weekend plans. In the summer of 2003, life in Willowbrook moved at the gentle pace of suburban Alabama, punctuated by the sounds of children playing and the distant hum of air conditioners working against the humid heat. Shay was preparing to start her 6th grade year at Northport Middle School. Like many children her age, she had a routine that her family could set their clocks by. Every school morning, she would wake up, get ready, and walk the short distance from her family's trailer to the bus stop. It was a journey she had made countless times before, a simple walk down familiar streets in a neighborhood where she felt safe and protected. Her mother Beth described Shay as a loving, vibrant child who brought joy to everyone around her. She was the kind of girl who made friends easily, who laughed often, and who had an infectious enthusiasm for life. Her stepfather Kevin had become an important figure in her life, providing stability and care in their blended family. Together, they had created a home filled with love and the ordinary rhythms of family life. Tuesday, August 19, 2003, began like any other day in the Thompson household. The summer was drawing to a close, and Shay was getting ready for another day of school. The morning air was thick with the promise of heat, and dark clouds were gathering overhead, threatening the afternoon thunderstorms that were common in Alabama during late summer. At approximately 6:55 a.m., Shay left her family's trailer and began her familiar walk to the school bus stop. She was dressed for school, carrying her backpack, probably thinking about the day ahead, classes, friends, maybe plans for after school. The bus stop wasn't far, just a short walk through the trailer park and down to the main road where she and other children gathered each morning. But something happened during those precious few minutes of her journey. Something that would change everything. Kevin Thompson, Shay's stepfather, was getting ready to leave for work when he heard the rumble of thunder overhead. Concerned about the approaching storm, he made a spontaneous decision that would haunt him for years to come. At 7:01 a.m., just 6 minutes after Shay had left the house, Kevin decided to drive to the bus stop to give Shay and any other children a ride to school to protect them from the impending rain. When Kevin arrived at the bus stop, Shay wasn't there. The other children waiting for the bus told him they hadn't seen her that morning. In that moment, Kevin felt the first cold fingers of worry creep into his chest. Shay was reliable, responsible. She always made it to the bus stop on time. Kevin drove back home, thinking perhaps Shay had returned for something she'd forgotten. Maybe she'd gone back for an umbrella or a homework assignment. But when he arrived at the trailer, Shay wasn't there either. Beth Thompson was just beginning her day, unaware that her daughter had never reached her destination. The family began calling Shay's friends, thinking perhaps she had stopped by someone's house or decided to walk to school with a classmate. But as the minutes ticked by and no one had seen Shay, the worry began to crystallize into something much more serious. By 8:30 a.m., when it became clear that Shay had not arrived at school, Beth Thompson made the call that every parent dreads making. She called the Northport Police Department to report her daughter missing. The response was immediate and massive. When an 11-year-old child goes missing, especially one with no history of running away, law enforcement treats it as a critical emergency. Within hours of Beth's call, the Northport Police Department had mobilized every available resource. The initial investigation focused on the 6-minute window between when Shay left her house and when Kevin arrived at the bus stop. 6 minutes. In those 6 precious minutes, a little girl had vanished without a trace from a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, where strangers were noticed, where children were protected by the watchful eyes of an entire community. Police began canvassing the neighborhood immediately, going door to door through the Willowbrook Trailer Park. They interviewed every resident, asking if anyone had seen Shay that morning, if anyone had noticed anything unusual, any strange vehicles, any unfamiliar faces. The response from the community was overwhelming. Neighbors who had watched Shay grow up joined the search efforts, walking through every yard, every vacant lot, every possible place an 11-year-old girl might be. Search dogs were brought in, their sensitive noses trained to pick up Shay's scent. They followed her trail from the family's trailer, tracking her path as she began her walk to the bus stop. But somewhere along that familiar route, the trail went cold. It was as if Shay had simply vanished into thin air. The FBI was called in to assist with the investigation, bringing their resources and expertise to bear on the case. Missing child cases in the first 48 hours are critical. Statistics show that if a child isn't found within the first few days, the likelihood of finding them alive decreases dramatically. Everyone involved in the search knew they were racing against time. Volunteers poured in from across West Alabama. Hundreds of people combed through wooded areas, vacant buildings, and waterways. They searched abandoned houses, checked wells and septic tanks, looked in places that no parent should ever have to imagine their child might be. The Black Warrior River was dragged. Helicopters circled overhead. For days, the search for Shay dominated local news and consumed the community's attention. Beth Thompson became the face of a mother's anguish, appearing on local television pleading for her daughter's safe return. She spoke of Shay's love for music and sports, her dreams of becoming a veterinarian, her kindness toward animals and younger children. Beth painted the picture of a normal, happy 11-year-old girl who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. As days turned into weeks, the investigation began to take on the methodical, painstaking work of a missing person case. Police interviewed and re-interviewed everyone who had been in the area that morning. They collected surveillance footage from nearby businesses, though the technology in 2003 wasn't as comprehensive as what we have today. The timeline was scrutinized down to the minute. Shay left at 6:55 a.m. Kevin left at 7:01 a.m. The bus arrived at its usual time around 7:15 a.m. Somewhere in that 20-minute window, something had happened to Shay Ross. Investigators looked into Shay's family life, as they must in any missing child case. They examined Beth and Kevin's relationship, their finances, their backgrounds. Both parents submitted to polygraph examinations, and Kevin's results showed no deception. Beth was cleared of any involvement early in the investigation. The family's cooperation was complete and immediate. They opened their lives to scrutiny because they wanted their daughter found. The search expanded beyond Northport. Police contacted law enforcement agencies across Alabama and neighboring states, sharing Shay's description and photograph. Her picture appeared on missing child websites, milk cartons, and bulletin boards throughout the region. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children took up her case, adding their resources to the search effort. As summer turned to fall and fall to winter, the massive search efforts gradually scaled back. The volunteers who had combed through the woods and fields returned to their daily lives, though they never forgot the little girl with the bright smile who had simply disappeared. The case moved from an active search to a missing person investigation, with detectives following up on tips and leads as they came in. Beth Thompson refused to give up hope. She organized vigils, kept Shay's story in the local media, and continued to believe that somehow, someway, her daughter would come home. She kept Shay's room exactly as it was the morning she disappeared, with her clothes laid out for school and her stuffed animals arranged on her bed. About 5 weeks after Shay's disappearance, something strange happened at the Thompson home. A fire broke out in Shay's bedroom, and only in her bedroom. The flames were contained to that single room, leaving the rest of the trailer untouched. The fire was suspicious enough that investigators examined it carefully, but they were never able to determine if it was connected to Shay's disappearance or simply a tragic coincidence in an already devastating situation. The fire destroyed many of Shay's personal belongings, including items that might have held her scent for search dogs. For Beth Thompson, watching her daughter's room burn felt like losing Shay all over again. The investigation into the fire yielded no conclusive answers, adding another layer of mystery to an already baffling case. As months passed, investigators began to notice troubling patterns. In August 2001, exactly 2 years before Shay's disappearance, 11-year-old Shannon Polk had vanished from her home in Lawrenceville, Georgia, while walking to her school bus stop. The similarities were striking. Both girls were 11, both disappeared while walking to catch their school buses, both lived in mobile home communities. Even more disturbing, on August 12, 2003, just 1 week before Shay disappeared, another 11-year-old girl named Teresa Dean had been abducted from her home in Talladega County, Alabama. Teresa was found alive after being sexually assaulted, and her abductor was arrested. The proximity in time and the similar ages of the victims led investigators to wonder if there might be a connection. The investigation expanded to look for links between these cases. Was someone specifically targeting 11-year-old girls in mobile home communities? Was there a predator moving through Alabama and neighboring states, hunting for vulnerable children? The questions multiplied, but concrete answers remained elusive. As 2003 turned to 2004, and 2004 to 2005, the case of Heaven Lachey Ross began to fade from the headlines. But for Beth Thompson, every day was a continuation of the same nightmare that had begun on that August morning. She continued to work with police, following up on every tip, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. The tips came in sporadically. Someone thought they saw a girl matching Shay's description at a gas station in Mississippi. Another caller claimed to have seen her getting into a car with an older man. Each lead was investigated thoroughly, but none led to Shay. With each dead end, the hope that had sustained Beth through the early days of the search grew a little dimmer. The community of Northport hadn't forgotten Shay either. Local businesses kept her missing person flyers posted in their windows. The school district held assemblies about stranger safety, using Shay's case as a stark reminder that danger could strike anywhere, even in the safest seeming places. Beth Thompson struggled with the not knowing. Was her daughter alive somewhere, held captive, hoping for rescue? Or had the worst happened, and Shay's suffering was over? The uncertainty was perhaps the cruelest aspect of the whole ordeal. Parents of missing children often speak of preferring even terrible news to no news at all, because at least then they would know how to grieve. During this time, advances in DNA technology and forensic science were making it possible to solve cold cases that had previously seemed hopeless. The investigators on Shay's case remained active, periodically reviewing evidence and following up on new technologies that might provide fresh insights. But as 2005 became 2006, the case remained as mysterious as ever. December 2006 brought an end to the uncertainty, though not the kind of ending anyone had hoped for. Hunters exploring an abandoned house on Creek Road in Holt, Alabama, made a discovery that would forever change the Ross case from a missing person investigation to a homicide. The house sat at the end of a rural dirt road, about 8 miles from where Shay had disappeared. It was the kind of place that local teenagers might explore on a dare, hidden among trees and far from the main roads. The structure had been abandoned for years, its windows broken, its walls covered with graffiti and the decay that comes from neglect. Inside this forgotten place, beneath the floorboards, were skeletal remains. The discovery was reported to the Tuscaloosa County Sheriff's Office, and investigators rushed to the scene. The remains were carefully excavated and sent for forensic analysis. Dental records confirmed what everyone feared but hoped wasn't true: the remains belonged to Heaven Lachey Ross. The call to Beth Thompson came on a cold December day, more than 3 years after her daughter had walked out of their trailer and never come home. After 1,215 days of not knowing, of hoping against hope, of imagining every possible scenario, Beth finally had her answer. Shay was gone. She had been gone all along. The location of the remains raised more questions than it answered. How had Shay ended up in an abandoned house 8 miles from where she disappeared? Who had brought her there? How long had she been there? The forensic analysis was limited by the condition of the remains and the length of time that had passed, making it impossible to determine an exact cause of death. The discovery of Shay's remains transformed the investigation but didn't bring the closure that her family desperately needed. The manner of death was officially ruled as undetermined, a frustrating conclusion that meant investigators couldn't say definitively how Shay had died, though the circumstances strongly suggested foul play. The abandoned house in Holt became a crime scene, thoroughly processed by forensic experts. They searched for any evidence that might tell them what had happened to Shay, who had brought her there, and when. The house was isolated, reached by a dirt road that wound through rural Tuscaloosa County. It wasn't the kind of place someone would stumble upon by accident. Whoever had brought Shay there knew the area well enough to find this hidden location. Investigators revisited every aspect of the original investigation with this new information. They re-examined the timeline of Shay's disappearance, looking for any clues they might have missed. They re-interviewed witnesses and family members, hoping that the discovery of the remains might jog someone's memory or encourage someone with information to come forward. The possible connections to other cases involving young girls were explored more thoroughly. Shannon Polk's case in Georgia, Teresa Dean's abduction in Talladega County, investigators looked for forensic connections, similar methodologies, anything that might suggest these crimes were committed by the same person. But despite the similarities, no concrete connections could be established. Beth Thompson now faced a different kind of nightmare. Instead of wondering if her daughter might still be alive somewhere, she had to grapple with the knowledge that Shay had been murdered. The grief was overwhelming, but it was mixed with frustration and anger at the lack of answers. Someone had taken her daughter's life, and that someone was still free. As the investigation continued into 2007 and beyond, the hard reality began to set in. Whoever had killed Heaven Lachey Ross had committed what appeared to be the perfect crime. Despite the massive search effort, the extensive investigation, and the discovery of her remains, no solid suspects had emerged. The case officially became a cold case, though investigators in Northport and Tuscaloosa County never closed the file. Detective work continued in fits and starts, with periodic reviews of evidence and follow-ups on tips that continued to trickle in. But as years passed, the trail grew increasingly cold. The lack of physical evidence was one of the biggest challenges facing investigators. The rural location where Shay's remains were found had been exposed to the elements for 3 years. Whatever forensic evidence might have existed had likely been compromised by time, weather, and the natural processes of decomposition. DNA technology was advancing rapidly during this period, but there was limited biological evidence to work with. The 6-minute window of Shay's disappearance remained the key to the case. In those 6 minutes, someone had encountered Shay on her walk to the bus stop, someone had taken her, and someone had made her disappear so completely that hundreds of searchers couldn't find a trace of her for over 3 years. It suggested a level of planning and knowledge of the area that was deeply disturbing. Beth Thompson became an advocate for missing children, using her daughter's case to raise awareness about child safety and the need for better investigative resources. She spoke at community events, worked with other families of missing children, and never stopped pushing for answers in Shay's case. Her strength in the face of unimaginable loss became an inspiration to others dealing with similar tragedies. Over the years, various theories have emerged about what might have happened to Heaven Lachey Ross. Each theory attempts to explain the seemingly impossible, how an 11-year-old girl could vanish without a trace from a busy neighborhood in broad daylight. One theory suggests that Shay was taken by someone she knew, someone who wouldn't have seemed threatening to her. This would explain how she could have been approached and convinced to get into a vehicle without screaming or running away. An acquaintance or neighbor might have been able to gain her trust long enough to get her away from the trailer park. Another possibility is that Shay was the victim of a stranger abduction, taken by someone who had been watching the neighborhood and knew her routine. The precision with which the abduction occurred, in that narrow 6-minute window, suggests someone who had planned carefully and knew exactly when and where to strike. The connection to the other cases involving 11-year-old girls remains tantalizing but unproven. Could there have been a serial predator targeting children of a specific age in mobile home communities? The timing of the incidents, all in August, all involving 11-year-old girls, all in similar communities, seems too coincidental to ignore, yet investigators have never been able to establish concrete links. Some have theorized that Shay's killer was someone local, someone familiar with the rural roads and abandoned buildings of Tuscaloosa County. The location where her remains were found wasn't somewhere a stranger would likely know about. It suggests someone with intimate knowledge of the area, someone who knew where a body could be hidden for years without discovery. The fire in Shay's bedroom weeks after her disappearance adds another layer of mystery. Was it simply a tragic coincidence, or was someone trying to destroy evidence? The timing seemed suspicious, but investigators were never able to determine if it was connected to her disappearance. Despite the passage of time, law enforcement agencies have never given up on solving Shay's murder. Advances in forensic technology have brought new hope to cold cases across the country, and investigators have periodically revisited Shay's case to see if new scientific techniques might yield fresh insights. DNA analysis has become increasingly sophisticated since 2006, capable of extracting genetic information from smaller and more degraded samples. While details about the physical evidence in Shay's case haven't been made public, investigators have indicated that they continue to explore all possible forensic avenues. The Northport Police Department has maintained that Shay's case remains an active investigation. New detectives have taken over the case as others retired, each bringing fresh eyes to the evidence and witness statements. They've interviewed new potential witnesses who might have been too young to be questioned at the time of Shay's disappearance but who might now remember something significant. In recent years, genetic genealogy has revolutionized cold case investigations across the country. This technique, which uses DNA evidence in combination with publicly available genetic databases, has solved numerous cases that had been cold for decades. While it's unclear if this technology can be applied to Shay's case, it represents the kind of scientific advancement that gives families like the Thompsons reason to hope. The case has also benefited from increased attention to missing children cases in general. Organizations like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children have developed new resources and techniques for investigating these cases, and cold case units have become more sophisticated in their approaches to unsolved crimes. For Beth Thompson, the passage of 20 years has not diminished her determination to find justice for her daughter. She has become a fixture in the true crime community, working with podcasters, journalists, and other advocates to keep Shay's story alive. She understands that public attention can sometimes lead to the tip that breaks a case wide open. Beth has had to endure not just the loss of her daughter, but the frustration of an unsolved case. She has spoken publicly about her struggles with the investigative process, her feeling that the family hasn't been kept adequately informed about the progress of the case. The lack of communication from law enforcement has added to her pain, leaving her feeling shut out of the search for justice for her own daughter. Every August 19th, the anniversary of Shay's disappearance, Beth organizes memorial events to honor her daughter's memory and to remind the community that the case remains unsolved. These gatherings serve multiple purposes. They keep Shay's story in the public consciousness, they provide comfort to Beth and others who loved Shay, and they send a message to anyone with information that the family and community haven't forgotten. The memorial events have become a tradition in Northport, drawing people who never met Shay but who have been touched by her story. Balloons are released into the Alabama sky, carrying with them the hopes and prayers of a community that refuses to let a little girl be forgotten. Local media covers these events, ensuring that new generations learn about Shay's case and might recognize details that could be significant. Beth has also had to navigate the secondary trauma that comes with an unsolved case. Over the years, she has dealt with false tips, cruel hoaxes, and well-meaning but misguided amateur investigators. Each potential lead brings a mixture of hope and dread, the possibility that this might finally be the breakthrough they've been waiting for, tempered by the knowledge that most tips don't lead anywhere meaningful. Shay's disappearance and murder had effects that rippled far beyond her immediate family. The case changed how the Northport community thought about child safety, leading to increased awareness about the vulnerability of children and the importance of community vigilance. Schools in the area implemented new safety protocols, and parents became more cautious about allowing their children to walk alone, even short distances in familiar neighborhoods. The innocence of a community where children could roam freely was shattered by the realization that danger could strike anywhere, at any time. The case also highlighted issues with communication and coordination between different law enforcement agencies. When a child goes missing, every minute counts, and the ability of different agencies to work together seamlessly can mean the difference between life and death. Shay's case became a learning experience that influenced how future missing child cases would be handled. For other families of missing children in Alabama and beyond, the Ross case became both a source of inspiration and a reminder of the long road ahead. Beth Thompson's advocacy work connected her with other families facing similar tragedies, creating a network of support and shared determination to find answers and justice. The case also attracted the attention of true crime enthusiasts and amateur investigators, particularly as the internet made it easier for people to research and discuss unsolved cases. While most of this attention has been well-intentioned, it has also meant that the family has had to deal with conspiracy theories, unfounded accusations, and the kind of speculation that can be both helpful and harmful to an ongoing investigation. In recent years, there has been renewed attention to Shay's case, driven in part by advances in forensic technology and in part by a growing public interest in cold cases. The success of genetic genealogy in solving decades-old murders has given new hope to families like the Thompsons, even though the specific applicability to Shay's case remains unclear. Law enforcement agencies across Alabama have been working to digitize old case files and apply new analytical techniques to cold cases. This process has led to breakthroughs in some cases, and investigators remain optimistic that advances in technology might eventually provide new leads in Shay's murder. The case has also benefited from increased media attention, including coverage by true crime podcasts, television shows, and online communities dedicated to solving cold cases. This exposure has introduced Shay's story to new audiences, people who might have information relevant to the case or who might recognize details that could be significant. In 2023, as the 20th anniversary of Shay's disappearance approached, there was renewed media coverage of the case. Local news stations ran retrospective pieces, and national true crime outlets picked up the story. This coverage brought fresh attention to the case and generated new tips for investigators to follow up on. The Northport Police Department has indicated that they continue to work the case actively, following up on new leads and periodically reviewing all evidence with fresh eyes. They have also expressed willingness to work with new technologies and investigative techniques as they become available. Today, More than 20 years after Heaven Lachey Ross walked out of her family's trailer for the last time, her case remains one of Alabama's most perplexing unsolved murders. The little girl who loved music and sports, who dreamed of becoming a veterinarian, who brought joy to everyone who knew her, deserves justice. Beth Thompson, now in her 50s, continues her fight for answers. She has never remarried, never had other children, dedicating her life to keeping Shay's memory alive and pushing for justice. She speaks of her daughter not just as a victim, but as a vibrant, loving child who had dreams and plans and a whole life ahead of her. The investigation remains open, and investigators continue to encourage anyone with information, no matter how small it might seem, to come forward. They emphasize that memories can return over time, that people who were children at the time of Shay's disappearance might now remember details that could be significant, and that someone, somewhere, knows what happened to Heaven Lachey Ross. The case serves as a reminder of the vulnerability of children and the importance of community vigilance. It also highlights the dedication of investigators who refuse to give up on unsolved cases, continuing to work for justice even when years have passed without significant progress. Advances in technology continue to offer hope. Genetic genealogy, improved DNA analysis techniques, digital forensics, and artificial intelligence applications in pattern recognition all represent potential avenues for solving cold cases like Shay's. What seems impossible today might become possible tomorrow through scientific advancement. The story of Heaven Lachey Ross is ultimately about more than just an unsolved murder. It's about a family's love, a community's resilience, and the enduring human need for truth and justice. It's about the way tragedy can galvanize people to work together, to search for answers, to refuse to let a child be forgotten. For those of us listening to this story, it serves as a reminder of the preciousness of ordinary moments, a child walking to a bus stop, a family having breakfast together, the simple routines that make up the fabric of our daily lives. Shay's story teaches us not to take these moments for granted, because we never know which ordinary Tuesday morning might be the last one. The case also reminds us of the importance of community awareness and the power of collective memory. Someone, somewhere, knows what happened to Heaven Lachey Ross. Maybe they were afraid to speak up at the time. Maybe they didn't realize the significance of what they saw. Maybe they convinced themselves it was none of their business. But it's never too late to do the right thing. If this story has taught us anything, it's that the truth has a way of eventually surfacing, even when it takes decades. Advances in science, changes in circumstances, shifts in relationships, all of these can lead to the breakthrough that finally brings justice. Cases that seem hopeless can suddenly crack wide open with a single piece of new information. As we conclude this journey into the mystery of Heaven Lachey Ross, we're left with the same questions that have haunted investigators for over 20 years. What happened during those 6 critical minutes on August 19, 2003? Who took Shay from her familiar neighborhood? Why was she murdered? And who has been living with the secret of her death all these years? Somewhere out there, someone knows the answers to these questions. Maybe they've carried this knowledge as a burden for 2 decades, maybe they've convinced themselves that too much time has passed for the truth to matter anymore. But for Beth Thompson and for the community that loved Shay, it's never too late for justice. Heaven Lachey Ross would have turned 31 years old on June 10, 2023. She might have become the veterinarian she dreamed of being. She might have had children of her own, contributing her joy and energy to a new generation. Instead, she remains forever 11 years old in the memories of those who loved her, a bright light extinguished too soon by someone who has never been held accountable for their actions. The case remains open. The Northport Police Department continues to accept tips and investigate leads. Modern forensic technology continues to advance, offering new possibilities for solving cold cases. And Beth Thompson continues her vigil, keeping her daughter's memory alive and fighting for the justice that has been delayed but not denied. If you have any information about the disappearance and murder of Heaven Lachey Ross, no matter how insignificant it might seem, please contact the Northport Police Department or your local law enforcement agency. Sometimes the smallest detail can be the key that unlocks the biggest mystery. Until someone is held accountable for Shay's murder, until the truth finally comes to light, her story serves as a reminder that every child deserves protection, every victim deserves justice, and every family deserves answers. The search for truth in the darkness continues, fueled by love, sustained by hope, and driven by the unshakable belief that justice delayed is not justice denied. Rest now, knowing that somewhere in the darkness, people are still working to bring light to this mystery. Somewhere, investigators are still reviewing evidence, still following leads, still believing that the truth will eventually prevail. And somewhere, a mother's love continues to burn bright, a beacon calling for justice for her daughter Heaven Lachey Ross. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.